This story is about my Uncle Jimmy. I'll try my best to tell it right, but I haven't heard it in the years since his passing, so my memory could be a little rusty, so please forgive any parts of this story that sound a little off. Now, my Uncle Jimmy was a simple man, possibly the most simple man you could ever meet. My dad's side of the family was raised in a very rural town far away from any big city. This meant their childhoods were spent raising farm animals and living off the land in whatever aspect they could. They of course had electricity and running water, but they used it sparingly so as not to rack up a large bill that, at the time, they couldn't afford. Uncle Jimmy was one of 7 kids in the household. He and my father were extremely close and a lot alike, but when my dad turned 18 and graduated high school, he left to go to a university a few states away, and he and Jimmy talked less and less in the years that followed. When it was Jimmy's turn to graduate and go off to college, he decided on a different course. He liked being out in the country and fending for himself. He said it made him feel like he was living the life God intended for humans, and that it made him feel closer to the earth and ultimately to himself. So when it was time for him to leave home, he did. He moved even further into the countryside. He found a cute small cabin in the middle of the woods with no power and no running water and said to himself, This is perfect." My dad didn't see Jimmy much after that. He says he wasn't super comfortable visiting Jimmy in what he always called the boonies, where he'd have to endure no running water and no electricity for a few days just to visit his brother. And Jimmy absolutely refused to leave his cabin for years, until this specific incident occurred. I had just been born. It was the mid-'80s and my dad was planning to ask Jimmy to come for a visit to meet his kid. He figured that he wouldn't come, but wanted to ask anyways. Now, it was hard to get a hold of Jimmy because of the whole off-the-grid thing that he had going on, so the best my dad could do was send a letter. The letter he got back shook him to his core. Now, the story goes like this. Jimmy had a dog, and boy, he loved this dog. Like the way a person loves and cherishes a child. It was a German short-haired pointer named Betsy. Betsy was a very well-trained and mannered hunting dog that went everywhere with Jimmy. Every night, Jimmy would let Betsy out of the cabin to run around for a bit before bringing her in at night. There had never been a problem with predators in the area that could pose a threat to Betsy, so he didn't even think twice about letting her outside. That night, after Betsy had been out for only about 30 minutes, he heard her scream. And not like a scream of excitement from playing or a scream to be let in. This was a scream of pure terror and agony. Jimmy rushed to his door and barreled his way outside when he saw his poor dog limping her way towards him. He always said the look on her face was one begging him to help her. I never understood that until I got my own dog and realized that they are very capable of expressing their emotions just by the way they look at you. Jimmy scooped her up as carefully as possible and rushed her inside. When he set her down, he realized that his hands were covered in blood. He began to fear the worst. He started to try to prepare himself for her untimely and unfortunate death that had to have been accidental. But when he checked her wounds, he was shocked and suddenly scared himself. Betsy had a large knife wound stretching across the back of her left leg. It was deep, but not so deep that she needed immediate medical attention. Jimmy figured that he could patch her up himself, and if she had issues later on, he would take the 4-hour drive into town to the vet's office. What really concerned him, though, was the fact that he lived over an hour from the next person's house, and his dog had just been slashed by a knife. A person with a knife. He closed and locked all his doors and windows that night, and as much as he needed it, there was no way that he could fall asleep. The next week went by without incident. Then the same the week after that, until eventually he was comfortable letting Betsy out again, with his supervision, of course. She had healed nicely, but still had a slight limp. As he was sitting on his porch one afternoon watching Betsy play in the small yard in front of his house, he spotted something in the forest. A silhouette of what looked to be a very large man peeking out from behind a tree, watching his dog intently. Jimmy yelled at the man to show himself and loudly asked who he was and what he was doing there. But in one swift motion, the man ran deeper into the forest where Jimmy could no longer see him. He called Betsy in and, like he had done before, he closed and locked all of his doors and windows for the night. As he lay in bed, he heard a tapping on his window. Light taps, but Jimmy was a light sleeper, so it took almost nothing to wake him. He slowly turned his head to the side to look at his window, and between his two curtains, through a small slit in the fabric, lit by the moonlight, he saw an eye peering into his bedroom. Thankfully, it wasn't looking at him at that moment, since he feared that probably would have made him even more terrified than he already was. But no. Instead, this eye was looking at Betsy, just as the man in the woods had done the previous afternoon. Jimmy kept his eyes locked on the mysterious person, and for hours he noticed this person never stopped staring at his dog. As night turned to day and the sun began peeking over the trees, Jimmy watched as the person moved from the window and listened as he made his way off of his deck and hopefully away from his property altogether. The next night, Jimmy made sure that his curtains were completely closed so nothing could see in or out. He didn't want to experience what had just happened the night before. This, unfortunately, only made things worse for him. He was woken up by a loud banging coming from his front door, like something or someone was trying its absolute best to make its way into his home to do God knows what to him and possibly his dog. Of course, he suspected it to be the same person who had been stalking him the past month, but he always made it very clear that no matter how many guns or knives he had, he did not want to come face to face with this person if he didn't have to. He grabbed a shotgun, pointed it at the door, and very sternly and as confidently as possible yelled towards the door, "Sir, I suggest you get off my property mighty quick. I have a shotgun pointed at the door, and I will shoot if you come into my house." The banging stopped, almost like the person was thinking about the warning. But it only stopped for a few seconds before it continued with even more force behind it. The door began to shake as it couldn't bear that much force against it, and Jimmy knew that it was about to break. He began screaming at the man to please just stop and leave, and that he didn't want to kill him. Betsy was going crazy, barking behind him, and for a second, it was like her barking fueled this intruder's anger. The door snapped, and through the broken pieces of wood, a hand reached through. Jimmy shot at the door, and with a force that knocked him back a few steps, the hand was gone. Jimmy stood in the same spot that he'd landed in after the shot for a couple of minutes, and after composing himself, he slowly made his way toward the door that was now covered in blood. Only he didn't find a body on his porch like he was expecting. Instead, he saw a thick trail of blood leading into the forest. Jimmy had no phone to call the police, and the closest phone was an hour away at a small market. When the sun was up, he loaded Betsy into his truck after locking up his house as best he could and headed off. He called the police from the market, and after waiting for about an hour for one to show up, he led them to his cabin. When they got there, Jimmy told them everything. They followed the trail of blood until they couldn't see it anymore, but they found nothing. They told Jimmy that they'd be opening up an investigation into the matter and told him that it would be probably smart to stay with family until they got everything sorted out and made an arrest or at least found the guy. They were sure that the person was bound to show up at a hospital with a gunshot wound to the hand. Jimmy, being the stubborn man that he was, patched up his door and decided to stay. The nights were getting colder in those winter months, and he figured if the guy wasn't already dead, that he would be from the cold eventually. And for the next few weeks, Jimmy would hear scratching on his door at night. In the morning, he would wake up to scratch marks deep in the wood on his door, and he swore that he would hear whispering outside his window, just saying his dog's name over and over again. They never tried to break in again, though, and although Jimmy was still freaked out, he didn't really feel threatened by this presence anymore. And in early January, 4 months after Betsy had been slashed by that knife, Jimmy woke up and made himself some coffee. He unlocked his front door and opened it, just about to take a step outside when there, leaning against one of the posts on his front porch, was the man. Only he wasn't moving. He was making zero attempts to get to Jimmy. And that's when he noticed that he wasn't not only moving, he wasn't breathing either. This time he wasted no time in driving down to the market with Betsy to call the police. They showed up in droves, and now surrounded the now crime scene. And it didn't take long to rule out Jimmy as a suspect when it was painfully obvious this man had died from being exposed to such freezing temperatures. It was also obviously the man that he had shot, since this person was missing several fingers on one of his hands. Jimmy had written back to my dad telling him all this, and at the end of the letter, also telling him that he'd be moving into our neighborhood in the next month. He'd already bought a house and was looking forward to spending more time with his family and getting out of the woods for a while. As I was growing up, I heard that story almost twice a year, every year until Jimmy passed in the late 90s from lung cancer. He never married or had any kids of his own, but he always insisted that he didn't mind since all of his siblings had so many kids that visited him all the time. Betsy passed when I was only 7 years old, and something in Jimmy died along with his dog. I can only hope that they're together again, best friends in life and death. I didn't know much about living in the wilderness when I bought a house with my best friend, but it was a really good deal that we just couldn't pass up. My friend Julie and I were going to school about a half an hour away, and buying a house for the next 4 years actually turned out to be cheaper than the rent would have been at the end of it all. Plus, this meant no landlords and we could do whatever we wanted with the place. The house was technically considered off-grid since it wasn't connected to our city's power grid, which of course helped us with the price. Thankfully, the previous owners agreed to sell us their solar panels as part of the overall price, which was actually super lucky. The house was also on septic, and we had a well, so even though it was off-grid, we still had all the luxuries of living in a house in the city. Julie and I both had pretty well-paying jobs, and I'm not ashamed to say that we both come from families who helped us with the mortgage from time to time. Anyways, the number one rule that I made with Julie when we agreed to buy this house together was that we wouldn't give our address to anyone but family. No friends, no boyfriends, and especially no random guys. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't want to risk the wrong person knowing that we, two 22-year-old women, were living 30 minutes outside of town, miles from the next house. It just didn't seem smart to me. Julie always said that she was fine with the rule, and for the first year we lived together, and she respected it. At least, I think she did. Then one day, in our second year of being housemates, I came home to her making out with some random guy on the sofa in the living room. I was livid. I screamed at the guy to get out, which of course only made Julie mad, but I really didn't care. I had boundaries, and my reason for not wanting men over to the house seemed pretty fair. After he left, she yelled at me that I was being stupid and having a guy over from time to time wasn't going to do anything bad. I tried telling her that it just wasn't smart letting people we don't even know into our house and letting it be known that we live alone with basically no means to protect ourselves. But she still didn't get it. She just kept saying, "This isn't the movie Taken. A guy isn't going to come back and kidnap and sell us. Calm down. Live a little." Her making fun of the situation made me feel like I had made a huge mistake buying this house with the person I thought I knew so well. She had been my best friend for 4 years, and I never got the impression that she would be so careless. I called my mom that night and told her what happened. She agreed with me that it was dumb of Julie to invite a guy over that she didn't even know. I also told her that it made me uncomfortable staying there, knowing this guy knew where we lived, who we were, and that we lived alone. I mean, it was obvious no guy lived with us. Every picture in the place was just 2 of us, and I'm pretty sure Julie probably told him that she only had 1 roommate. It wouldn't have been a shocker if she did. She brought him back to the house after all, so telling him about her life wouldn't have been a big deal. My mom told me that if I was uncomfortable that I could just stay with her for a few nights, and if I wanted to go back after, then I could, and if not, I could stay however long I needed. I appreciated the offer and decided that I'd go to school the next day, go home, pack some things, and then head off to my mom's for a bit. Julie thought that I was being dramatic, but I didn't care. I went to school the next day as planned and made my way back to the house that afternoon. I decided to wait until Julie got home to let her know how long I'd be gone and just to make sure that she'd locked up. Clearly, she wasn't the most responsible person, so I couldn't rely on her to secure the place after I left. At around 8 p.m., I decided I was done waiting and began making my way to the front door with my bag in hand. When I reached the hall that led into the living room, I stopped in my tracks. Thankfully, the darkness that filled the house hid me as I watched two men in black masks standing at the door behind the frosted glass. They were talking to each other when I heard one of them say, "I'm telling you, man, the girls who live here, they're all types of fine. Now get the door open before they hear you." My heart sank and I didn't know what to do. I just had to hide. I guess now I realize that I probably should have slipped out the back door, but I really wasn't thinking. Instead, I slowly walked back into my room, shut and locked the door, and started trying to find some places to hide. I watched a movie the previous night that gave me the idea of opening my window to make it look as though I'd gone out that way, so I did that, and climbed into the back of my closet and hid under a couple of thick comforters I'd shoved back there after last winter. I heard the sound of the glass in the front door shattering, and I felt tears beginning to streak down my face. I wasn't going to be one of those girls you see in movies and TV shows who can't keep quiet, though. I was barely breathing so I wouldn't make a sound. I listened as they made their way through the house, loudly arguing with each other that they hadn't found us yet. I silenced my phone so it wouldn't give up my hiding spot if it were to go off, and I texted Julie not to come home, that people had broken into our house and to call 911 immediately. I also texted my mom and told her what was happening and for her to call 911 too. Of course, they both started blowing up my phone, but when I heard the men try the handle to my bedroom door, I couldn't focus on anything but staying hidden and staying quiet. "She's gotta be in here. Her car's out front. I'm gonna be so pissed if she's not, and you had me break into this house for nothing." They argued back and forth like that for a couple of minutes until one of them must have gotten tired of it and kicked the door in. I was relieved when the window trick seemed to work and they screamed at each other that I'd gotten away. The relief only lasted a minute though, when one of them told the other to look around for anything they could take that might have been worth something. I started praying that they wouldn't look too far into my closet, that they wouldn't pull back the comforters I was under and do what men do to women whose houses they break into. I heard one of the men leave my room, but I could tell one of them stayed. I heard him begin to go through my drawers and throw things across the room. He seemed frustrated, which was probably due to the fact that I don't own super nice things. No expensive jewelry, nothing designer. I could never justify spending that kind of money, and clearly this guy didn't appreciate that. My breath stopped in my throat when I heard his footsteps get closer to the closet doors. I didn't move an inch. There was no way that I was going to give this guy any reason to believe I was in there. It felt like I was going to have a heart attack when he opened the closet doors. I could feel the vibrations of him moving things around off the shelves overhead, and just when I felt him grab hold of the blankets I was under, his friend burst into the room, yelling that they had to go. Apparently they heard sirens down the road and got scared. They ran out of the house and I stayed in my spot. I had every intention of staying there all night. I was terrified of the possibility that they were still there. And that was until I heard my mom's voice, calling for me from inside the house. I tore the comforters off my body, and as quickly as I could, I ran toward my mom's voice. The second I saw her, I burst into tears. All the emotion I'd held in that whole time was being let out, and I couldn't control it. I wish I could tell you that they found the men who broke in, but they didn't. They left behind no evidence, and the police didn't find anyone in the woods surrounding the house. The guy Julie brought over the previous night had a solid alibi too, so they ruled him out. He also denied telling anyone where we lived, but I don't buy it. I moved out the next day. It took a while, but Julie eventually agreed to take my name off the mortgage. One of our other friends moved in with her, and I moved back in with my parents. I feel safer with them. I just wish they'd caught the guys who terrorized me that night. I'm a 38-year-old female, and I live with my husband and 4-year-old son. We decided that we wanted to live off the grid about a year after our son was born. The world's been going in a weird direction, and cutting ourselves off from it seemed like a good idea at the time. We bought a small house in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, and apart from the story I'm about to tell you, we loved every second of it. We have a family dairy cow that produces a lot of milk, about 6 to 7 gallons a day, which is way more than a family of 3 can drink. More than anyone can drink in a day, actually, but where we live, people love to drink raw, unprocessed milk. It's a controversial topic that I won't get into right now, but with the excess milk we constantly had, my husband suggested that we post a Craigslist ad to barter our milk. You know, trade the milk for other items we may need or want, like fresh fruits and veggies or farm equipment. We figured it couldn't hurt and that it would be fun to meet new like-minded people in the process. We posted our ad and we didn't get any responses for a while. I started feeling a little defeated about the whole thing, and that's when I got an email from a woman named Christina. She told me that she absolutely would love to trade for some milk, and I won't lie when I say that I was a little excited too. We emailed back and forth for a couple of days, and she told me that she grew organic berries that she would want to trade. I thought everything was going great until she suddenly just stopped emailing back. I emailed her again 4 days later to ask if she got my emails, but again, got no response. It was like she was purposefully ignoring me, but my husband told me that sometimes people get busy and I shouldn't take it personally, so I didn't. I moved on and continued to wait for another person to see the ad. Over a week and a half later, I finally got a response from Christina. She was angry that I had emailed her in the middle of the night and it was my fault that she hadn't seen it. She said that it was very irresponsible of me to email so late and that it wasn't a good way to run a business. And I was shocked. I looked over my previous emails to her and was confused when I saw that I, in fact, hadn't emailed her in the middle of the night but in the afternoon, and I didn't understand her comment about this, not being a good way to run a business because I wasn't running a business. It was a Craigslist ad. I chose not to respond to her because of her obvious problem with me and her incapability to take responsibility for her own actions. I thought ignoring her would have meant that I'd be done with the situation. I was wrong. Instead, she continued to email me multiple times a day for the next 2 days, reminding me of her emails and telling me to email her back. Finally, 2 days later, she wrote to me once again, this time saying something that genuinely terrified me. She said that she was tired of me ghosting her. She was offended and was very angry that I would do that to a sweet old lady like her, and that if I wasn't going to give her the milk, she was just going to take it herself. I didn't really understand what she meant by that. Was she going to find where we live and milk our cow? I showed my husband and we laughed about it together, and again, I didn't email her back. Why would I? Clearly this woman had some serious issues. That night we heard rustling outside of her house, but that was something that we were used to. There were lots of animals in the area that weren't afraid to come up to the house throughout the night. Our son came into our room really early in the morning and swore to us that he was hearing footsteps outside of his window. My husband and I tried to reassure him that it was probably just a deer, but he was sure that it sounded like a person or monster walking back and forth just outside his window. He was scared, so we let him sleep in our bed until it was time to wake up. That morning, my husband went outside to check for footsteps, and to our surprise, he actually found some. Whoever it was wore a very small-sized shoe and definitely was pacing all night based on the deep footprints that went back and forth in the mud outside his window. It's pretty strange seeing footsteps outside our house that aren't ours. We live so far outside of town and own the property surrounding our house, 30 acres of it. My husband searched the forest surrounding our house but found nothing. When I went out to milk our cow, I was horrified to find her covered in black spray paint. Her back was littered with it. When my husband came out to help me, he was just as shocked as I was. I still had to milk her though, and honestly I felt a little bad doing it. Cows are very sensitive animals, and I could tell that she was scared and probably in shock just as much as we were. Only when I went to milk her and was massaging her udder, I noticed her bag seemed a little small, almost like how it feels after being milked. Then, when I went to clear her teats of the first few squeezes of milk, there was almost nothing coming out. Someone had literally milked our cow, and sometime throughout the night also spray painted her back. I thought back to the crazy email the woman had left, and I knew it had to have been her. We knew no one else would do something like this. While my husband and I were trying to clean off her back, we heard our son scream from inside the house. We both dropped what we were doing, and when we got inside, we saw a jug of milk on the counter and muddy footprints leading to our son's room. We rushed to his bedroom door, and when we looked inside, we saw a woman sitting on our son's bed with him on her lap. She was holding him tightly, smiling at us with this eerily emotionless look on her face as he squirmed in her grasp. I was going to tell her to let him go, but my husband had other plans. He'd always been the no-nonsense kind of guy, and so he just walked right up to her and punched her in the face. She let go of our son as she brought her hand up to her nose, and my husband took the opportunity to grab him and pull him away from her. He grabbed my arm on the way out of the room and led us out of the house and put us in his truck and locked it. He went back inside, and the next thing I knew, he was physically carrying this woman out of the house and forcing her to sit on the porch. Every time she tried to get up, he just shoved her right back down. She was no match for him. He made sure that there was no way she was leaving. I had already called the police the second we were in the truck, and they arrived about 30 minutes later. While we waited for them, the woman only said one thing: "You shouldn't have ignored me." My husband and I aren't really the outdoorsy type. We both grew up in big cities and never really felt the need to move anywhere smaller. But for our honeymoon, my husband decided that it might be fun to get out of our comfort zones and rent a vacation rental in the Montana wilderness for 5 days. I wasn't too excited about it, considering I was hoping for a lavish Hawaiian honeymoon or something similar. But any time with my husband was bound to be a good time. We drove from our home in eastern Washington to the quaint little cabin a few hours away in Montana. When we got there, we were quickly made aware that there was no electricity in the cabin. There was running water, but no toilet. If we needed to go to the bathroom, we had to walk about 20 feet from the cabin to the outhouse. And I was quite upset, to say the least. When my husband said that we'd be staying in a cute house in the woods, I was expecting there to at least be power supplied to the house. He swore the ad said nothing about there being no electricity, but I was so mad that I didn't even know if I should believe him or not. Maybe he thought that it would just be fun to go without while we were there. My husband was definitely the more adventurous type, and that wouldn't normally have been something that would have stopped him from picking this place. We brought our bags to the door, and my husband pulled the key from the undermat where the host said it would be. He opened the door and brought our bags inside, and when we went to sit on the sofa, we noticed a very large binder sitting on the coffee table labeled Rules. My husband and I had stayed in plenty of vacation rentals and had only come across an actual physical rule book a handful of times, and when we had, they were usually only a page or two. When I say this rule book was a binder, I mean it was a literal binder, at least 50 pages of very in-depth rules about staying in this house. My husband and I laughed it off and made quick comments about how it was a little strange, but we weren't going to let it stop us from having a good time. My husband set the binder back down, and only 10 seconds later, his phone chimed. It was a text from the host that read, "Please make sure to read all the rules." We honestly just thought it was a weird coincidence. We had just put the binder down without reading anything, and they texted us to make sure to read it. It was almost like they knew. That night, my husband went around the house lighting candles to give us some light, and he locked all the doors and windows, something we were accustomed to since living in the city. We left our bags in the living room and changed into our pajamas and read for a bit in bed before blowing out the candles and going to sleep. The next morning, we woke up, and when we went into the living room, I noticed our bags were open when I was sure that we had closed them the night before. I looked everywhere for my sundress. I knew I packed it, but it wasn't there. When my husband joined me in the living room, I mentioned to him that our bags were open when we had closed them, and he had brushed it off and said that we probably left them open and I remembered wrong. I knew, though, something was wrong here. My husband got himself a glass of water and sat down, setting his glass on the wood table in front of him. Another chime on the phone came seconds later. This time it simply read, Rule 5, page 3 of the binder. Always use a coaster when placing a glass on any surface. And this is when my husband and I started feeling extremely creeped out. How did they know he wasn't using a coaster? How did they know he got something to drink? My husband texted back and asked if they were watching us, and they said no. They said they always remind guests of the coaster rule the morning after they arrive, since apparently that's when people are most likely to sit at the table with a drink. We didn't really know what to think, but they had really great reviews and we just chalked it up to another coincidence. Thinking about it now, we probably should have seen the writing on the wall and left, but my husband reassured me that everything was fine and that we should stay. That day was spent mostly hanging around the house, doing what newly married couples do. It was nice and we didn't get any more texts from the hosts, which eased my nerves a bit. The day after, we decided that we wanted to go on a hike to the nearby lake to take a swim. We got our hiking gear on and packed our backpacks with what we needed, locked the door, and headed off down the trail by the house. The hike was amazing. It was so beautiful and the water down at the lake was crystal clear. By mid-afternoon, we were ready to head back. When we got back to the house, my husband was about to unlock the door when he realized that it was already unlocked. When we entered the kitchen, there was a note on the counter from the host that said that they had left us more towels and extra sheets, and to please make sure all love-making was kept in the bedroom. My husband was immediately angry, and both of us started to believe these people were watching us. My husband told me to pack my bags and that we were leaving. After we were packed, we made our way to the front door, and when we opened it, there was a man and a woman standing in front of us. They introduced themselves as the hosts, and they wanted to know why we were leaving. This just confirmed it to us. These people had been watching us, and who knows what they had seen. The real shocker here was that this woman had shown up wearing my dress, my missing sundress. She'd actually stolen it from me and had the audacity to show up wearing it right in front of me. My husband had noticed too and mentioned it, and of course they denied everything. When we were on the road out of there, we contacted the vacation rental company and filed a complaint against the hosts. We also filed a report with the police for the theft. Unfortunately, the woman was somehow able to come up with a receipt for the dress, and apparently it is completely legal for a vacation rental to have cameras up in their rental properties. They had erased all footage from our stay, saying that it was customary to delete whatever was recorded after a person's stay had ended, but we knew the real reason they erased it. When we complained about there being no power to the property, and it not being mentioned in the listing, the host actually supplied proof that the house did have electricity, and they said that it was mistakenly turned off for the duration of our stay. We feel like our whole honeymoon was ruined by this total invasion of our privacy, and we haven't been able to stay in a vacation rental since. My husband did make it up to me, though, with a week-long Hawaiian vacation like I originally wanted, which I was extremely grateful for. The last time we checked about a month ago, their rental property was still up. Honestly, I just feel really bad for the next unsuspecting person who stays in that house. I'm in my late 20s now, but the story I'm about to tell you takes place when I was 12 and my brother was 14. We lived with our parents in a small cottage in the countryside. We had no electricity and only had running water in the warmer months from our gravity-fed hoses off of the seasonal creek. Most people probably would have hated it, but when you're raised in it and know nothing else, you have no reason to dislike it. I didn't know a lot about the world outside of our property. My dad hunted, and that is how we got most of our meat, and my mom grew a huge garden from spring to early fall. We also raised pigs, chickens, goats, and had a dairy cow named Della. My mom canned all the excess food throughout the year, so when winter came, we would have plenty to eat and live off of. She cooked on our wood stove even during the warmer months, and she homeschooled us and taught my brother and I everything we know. One fall, it was exceptionally stormy, and my mom had told me to go milk the goats. I was mad about it since it was early in the morning and all I wanted to do was sleep, but she was adamant that I help out. Apparently, she'd been up all night trying to secure the animals' pens. Our dad had been away on a hunting trip for a week at that point. I slowly and sluggishly made my way outside. and to get to the goat stalls you had to pass by the pig pens. They had their own little structure out there that kept them out of the wind and rain. In the early mornings, my mom would let them out. Only this time, when I walked by the pig pen, I noticed one of our pigs, Chunky, wasn't there. I climbed over the fence into the pen and made my way into their small structure. I saw Kareen and Freudis cuddling like they usually do, but no Chunky in sight. I started panicking a little since Chunky had always been my favorite. I ran back up to the house and asked my mom if she'd seen Chunky this morning. She told me that when she let the pigs out only a couple of hours before, Chunky was with them. I told her she was missing, but my mom wasn't really worried. Chunky was a troublemaker who got out from time to time, but she always came back, and we treated her really well, and she knew where her home was. She was actually very smart. I told my mom I was worried and that I was going to go around the property looking for her once I was done milking the goats. And the whole time that I was milking them, all I could think of was Chunky out somewhere in the property, alone, wet and cold. After about an hour of milking the goats, I was finally done. I brought the milk to my mom and kissed her cheek before making my way back outside in my rubber boots and raincoat. I spent the rest of that day looking for Chunky, but I just couldn't find her. My brother Tony even came out to help me look, but he didn't like the pigs so much, so he gave up after joining in the search for about an hour. As it got dark, my mom told me to come inside. I hated not knowing where she was. My mom kept reassuring me that Chunky was okay and that she'd probably be back by morning, but I knew that there was something wrong. I didn't sleep much that night, and the second the sun peeked through my curtains, I was up and out the door. I didn't make it very far before screaming at the sight in front of me. There on the front lawn was Chunky's lifeless body, torn to shreds by some animal. I fell to the ground in tears as my mom and brother ran outside to see what was going on, and I couldn't take my eyes off her as I sobbed. That whole day, all I could think about was Chunky and how she didn't deserve to die that way. My mom was more concerned about the fact that one of her animals had been attacked so close to home. She knew it meant that whatever had done this would probably be back for more now that it knew that it was somewhere to find something to eat. For the next week, we kept our animals in their houses. It worked for a bit until one morning we woke up again to one of our goat stalls torn open by something and all 4 goats dead. My mom wouldn't let me know what it had done, but by the look on my brother's face when he came back from helping mom clean up, I knew that it was bad. My dad came home a few days after the goat incident, and he helped to secure the other structures and stalls as best he could. We were hoping that that would deter whatever was attacking our animals, but of course it didn't. Next, our whole flock of chickens was massacred. It was a bloodbath in their coop. We had no idea what was taking the lives of our animals, but we had no choice but to figure it out. This wasn't just our pets it was eating, this was also our source of food, and we couldn't just keep letting it kill our animals. My dad and brother decided that night that they'd sit up in the hunting blind by the goat stalls and hopefully they'd see whatever it was that was preying on our animals at night. Unfortunately for them, what they weren't expecting to see was a very large mountain lion making its way onto the property. My brother told me the second our dad saw it, he threw his hand over both their mouths to not make a sound. You see, mountain lions are very good at something that my dad hadn't counted on: climbing trees. Of course, in a moment of panic, my brother gasped and the mountain lion locked eyes on the both of them. My dad had his rifle in his hand, and although he didn't revel in the thought of killing this creature, in that moment, he knew that he would have to do it. My brother started to cry out of fear even though he was trying his absolute best not to. He'd never been in a situation like that, and he just couldn't hold his emotions in at all. In one quick motion, the mountain lion sprang onto the base of the tree and quickly started climbing its way up toward my father and brother. And that's when my mom and I heard the screaming. We rushed out into the porch, but it being the middle of the night meant that we couldn't see anything, only hear the screams of pure terror coming from my brother, then the gunshot and a thump. My mother began running towards the tree that she knew that they were in, but we heard my dad call out to us to go back inside and shut the door. After around 10 minutes, they came inside and my dad told us what had happened. As the mountain lion was making its way up the tree toward them, my dad knew that he had one chance to shoot it before it reached them. His eyes had acclimated to the low light, and with only light from the moon to help him, he made the shot. And he watched as the big cat fell to the ground with a loud thump. He told my mom and I to go back inside in case he hadn't killed it, and he was worried that maybe it had enough fight left in it that if it saw my mom and I, that maybe it would come for us next. But by the time he and my brother climbed down the tree, he knew it was dead. Straight shot between the eyes. The next morning, he reported the killing and animal attacks to local authorities and game management, who came by and collected the mountain lion. After that, we didn't have any more problems with large predators except for the occasional chicken being killed by a hawk. I moved off the farm when I was 20, but not too far away. I visit often with my husband and daughter, and about once a year, my dad just loves to tell the story about how he saved my brother's life. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. My mom and dad have raised me and my brother in the same house throughout both of our childhoods. It's what some would call off the beaten path, and man, I hated it. Me and my brother both went to school in the city, and hearing about the lives all my friends had that I just couldn't relate to only made me angry about the life I lived. A life full of shoveling cow manure and slaughtering the animals I always got way too attached to. My brother never seemed to mind it though. He was my dad's favorite, still is, especially after what happened. For context, this happened when I was 15 and my brother was about to turn 17. My dad had asked both of us to go on a hunting trip with him to hunt bear, and I had absolutely no intention on going until my mom told me that I had to. She knew I wasn't close with our dad, and she wanted that to change. She was hoping this trip would be the bonding experience we both needed. Unfortunately, I'm pretty stubborn, and having her make me go only made me hate it even more. It was a 5-day trip in the woods with my dad. He had a satellite phone in case of emergencies, and that was all the technology that was allowed. He thought it would be fun to build our own fires and catch our own food while we were out there, and I was dreading it. The day came for us to leave, and the whole morning I was just begging my mom not to make me go. The begging did nothing, absolutely nothing, of course, and I found myself walking behind my dad and brother only a couple of hours later. Thankfully, it wasn't too cold, and I wouldn't have to cuddle my dad and brother for warmth like we had to do on our last hunting trip. That was humiliating. It didn't take long for my dad to find bear droppings. I will say that even though I hated hunting and tracking animals for days, my dad was great at it. He actually led other people on hunting trips during the season, so I knew that we'd be coming home with something for my mom to cook up. We tracked the bear for the rest of the day, and by nightfall, we found a good enough clearing to make camp. My dad always insisted on sleeping in hammocks far off the ground so no predators could reach us. I didn't like it. My fear of heights didn't allow me to be comfortable enough to sleep like that high off the ground. It may have only been 12 or so feet, but still, it felt terrifying up there. I don't know what time it was when I began to hear the grunting. At first, I just thought it was my dad's insanely loud snoring, but something was different. It wasn't as loud and annoying as usual. It was more of a deep snarl of some sort, and as much as I didn't want to peek out of my hammock and look down, my curiosity got the better of me. I moved the fabric of my hammock only a few inches to the left, just enough for me to see down onto our makeshift campsite. It was dark, but the fire was still somewhat lighting the area. I looked toward where the grunting noise was coming from and almost gasped when I saw a bear, bigger than any I'd ever seen before, standing on its hind legs just under the hammock my brother was in. I felt my eyes widen as I started to panic. I didn't know what to do. Well, I did know what to do. I just didn't know how I was going to do it. I needed to wake up my dad. He would know what to do. I had brought a granola bar in my hammock with me, and I figured if I threw it hard enough, I would hit my dad with it, wake him up and distract the bear all at once. But the only problem was I only had one chance. I took a deep breath, and as hard as I could, from the awkward position I was lying in, I chucked the bar at my dad, hoping it would be enough to wake him. In the silence of the night, the sound of the granola bar hitting my dad sounded like a motorcycle starting up. Thankfully, it was enough to wake him, only he woke up annoyed and loud. I shushed at him and pointed to the bear now making its way to the granola bar that had fallen to the ground. His eyes widened as he quickly looked back at me, realizing the dangerous situation we were in. All hopes of him saving us went away when he pointed to his gun leaning up against the tree on the ground beneath him. He threw something at my brother, who quickly woke up, and it took a second to make him aware of the whole situation too. With all of us awake, we knew the only thing that we could do was wait it out. And for hours, we sat in our hammock and waited as the bear stared at us, grunting and sniffing in our direction. My dad whispered that he was confused why it had begun climbing one of the trees to reach us, but of course, he was also thankful that it hadn't. Apparently, it's a myth that bears can't climb trees, which only made me question my dad's hammock logic even more. I was grateful for them in that moment, though. Better to be up there than on the ground with the bear. We heard my brother begin to squirm in his hammock, and I watched my dad try to get him to calm down. But instead of calming down, he just pointed to the rope that tied the hammock to one of the trees. It had begun to rip away from the fabric of the hammock, and we realized that we had to act quickly. My dad whispered to me and told me that we had to figure out a way to distract the bear long enough for my dad to climb down and get his gun. My brother and I didn't think that it would be possible since the bear had been focused on nothing but us for hours, but we had no other choice. We decided our best option would be for my brother to climb out of his hammock and sit on the nearby small branch of the tree that he was tied to, rip his hammock off of the tree, and throw it on top of the bear. It was a stupid plan, but it's what we came up with. We couldn't spend the rest of our lives in that tree after all, so we did just that. My brother carefully climbed out of his hammock and onto the branch, and I cringed as it began to bend downwards. From there, he pulled on the hammock as hard as he could until it came loose. He then untied the other side until it was free. We all counted on 3. My brother threw the hammock onto the bear, and I guess my dad thought jumping straight down was his best bet. He fell slightly on his impact, but thankfully the bear was somewhat distracted. It took only a few seconds for the bear to get the fabric away from its face and notice my dad on the ground. It started to charge at him, but it didn't get far since my dad already had it in his sight and shot at it over and over again. Finally, it was down, and that nightmare of that hunting trip was over. My dad used that satellite phone to call his buddies to help him haul the bear out of there, and he and my mom butchered it at home like they usually do after he goes hunting. My mom wasn't happy about what happened and said my dad should have been more responsible and kept the gun with him, but she was proud of my brother and I for being so brave and for helping my dad bag a bear as big as that one. Apparently, it was the biggest he'd ever gotten. I didn't and still don't feel very brave, though. I was just glad that I made it out of there alive. Thankfully now, my mom doesn't make me go on any more hunting trips with my dad. He doesn't mind, though. That trip only made him closer with my brother, and he never asked me to go again. He tells everyone how my brother was a hero for throwing his hammock over the bear and how I just sat there. It made me feel bad for a while, but I don't mind, as long as I get to stay home during hunting season. This story is about my mom and dad. It happened when they were newlyweds and had bought their first home together. My mom was so excited to be living on her own with my dad. They were both in their early 20s and she'd lived at home with her parents up until that point. The house they bought was more of a fixer-upper, but the style of home was exactly what my mother wanted and the location was exactly what my father wanted. It was more rural and in the country than my mother would have wanted, but they both got something that made them happy, and compromise was important. They moved in late August and everything was great. The weather was still hot, but they knew cooler days were ahead with fall just around the corner. By early October, Mom and Dad had been hearing around town that storms were to be expected this time of year. By the sounds of it, they could get really bad. Heavy winds and rain. And one Thursday afternoon in late October, there was a weather warning for their area. They asked people in town what they were expected to do for a storm like that, and everyone said the same thing. board up all doors and windows, and just in case, cut off all power. They didn't understand that part of it, but it really didn't matter anyway since my dad was still in the process of getting a permit to run electricity to the house. The storm was coming very early the next day, and that night, both Mom and Dad spent hours boarding up all the doors and windows. By the time they finally finished, the storm had begun to roll in. They closed the front door behind them and sealed it from the inside as best they could and headed to their bedroom, their path lit by small candles that they were holding. My mom and dad waited most of the storm out in their bedroom, reading their books and playing board games. They had tried to sleep, but the noise of the wind and rain kept them up. At around 3 in the morning, the wind seemed to pick up. It was getting louder and louder, even making the house shake. They heard trees falling in the forest surrounding their house as they landed with a loud bang. The crunching and snapping of the branches had started to really scare my mom. She was worried about a tree possibly falling on the house and them not knowing when or where it would fall. They heard the sound of a tree breaking from its base for what seemed like the 100th time that night, only this time when it fell, they heard the crunching of metal and their car alarm went off. Now, even if they wanted to, there really was no escaping that storm, not by car anyways. Then it happened. A tree fell right into their bedroom. Debris was flying everywhere, and the force of it falling launched my mom back several feet. It was pitch black apart from the occasional lightning strike lighting up what was left of the bedroom walls. My mom was scared and confused as she called out my father's name. Wind and rain whipped through the now gaping hole in what was once their safe haven. My mother's face was covered in her wet hair, and she tried desperately to move it out of her eyes so they could find my father. He wasn't responding to her shouts for him to come to her. My mom had begun to believe the tree may have crushed him. The grief she felt in that moment was immense until she heard a groan come from next to the fallen tree. There on the floor next to the bed was my father. His arm was wedged under the tree, and he was almost being drowned by the downpour of rain on his face. My mother grabbed a nearby raincoat that used to be in the now torn-apart closet and shielded both of their faces. She couldn't exactly tell because of everything going on around them, but my father was losing blood fast. He was completely out of it and didn't really know what was going on or what had just happened. He kept asking my mother to help him up over and over again, and she had to tell him that he was stuck and that they had to wait for help to come. They had no power, so no landline, and this was a time before cell phones, and my mom felt hopeless. She thought that she was going to lose the man that she loved. She had only one option. It was a fleeting thought in her mind that only lasted a second, but it was brought to life when my father thought of the same thing and told her to do it. He was starting to gain full awareness now, but thankfully his body was in enough shock to ensure that he felt no pain. He told her that she had to get to the neighbor's house and try to call for help, but my mother told him that there was no way that she could leave him. She could never forgive herself if she left him and came back to his lifeless body where he would have died alone. So instead he suggested what she was silently thinking. They needed to cut off his arm. The seconds felt like hours in the time that passed after he suggested something that she wasn't so prepared to do. He kept reassuring her that everything would be all right. He instructed her to get his axe from next to the bed. He had kept it there in case of intruders during the night. Then he told her to tie something very tight to the top of his arm to decrease the blood flow to the area. My mother had told me multiple times that moment was the scariest moment of her entire life. Scarier than childbirth, and way scarier than being a first-time mother. She lifted the axe and he begged her not to hesitate. Hesitation would only possibly result in more injury for him and even maybe for herself. He slowly counted to 3, and as the wind and rain seemed to slow in that 1 second, she drove the axe down into his arm. He screamed, and she cried when she realized that it hadn't gone all the way through. She was now certain that she may have given him his death sentence, but my father was as calm as he could have been in that situation and told her to go again. She was scared, and it was taking her a second to compose herself, but she didn't have a second. He told her that she needed to do it immediately or he wasn't going to have a chance. She lifted it once more, and in one more blow, he was free. She grabbed a nearby shirt that was relatively dry and wrapped it around the stump that now replaced his arm. They both, holding on to one another, climbed over the now broken pieces of debris that was once their house and began making their way down the long driveway to hopefully reach their neighbor's house in time to get some help. My father had begun leaning against my mother for support as he continued to lose blood. The mud was basically just slopped and slowed them down in a situation where they needed to go as quickly as possible. By the time they reached the bottom of the driveway, my father had begun to go limp, and my mother was practically carrying him, dragging him. She wasn't ready to give up as she begged him not to. A point came where she finally couldn't carry him any longer. She laid him down under a tree in a spot she thought was drier than the rest, and slowly and sadly said her goodbyes to the man that she thought she would grow old with. He was conscious enough to let her know that he loved her and that he would always be with her even if it wasn't in person. Early morning came and the storm died down. My mother was found on the side of the road when their neighbors were driving into town. She was still clutching onto my father and crying into his chest. Police were called, but of course, nothing could be done to save my father. My mother never really fully moved on from his death and how traumatic the whole night had been. She found out that she was pregnant with me only a month later, and she always said that I'm the greatest reminder of the man she loved so deeply. She hasn't remarried, and I've only heard this story once when she thought I was finally old enough to understand why my father had never been in my life and what happened to him. It's too traumatic for her to think about. Our house is still full of pictures of them together, and every year we celebrate his birthday. And of course, I feel for her. I can't imagine how hard it must have been to start a life with someone only to have it torn away from you so quickly. My husband does everything for our family. If we didn't have him, there's no way our children and I would have survived out here by ourselves. For context, my husband leaves for a few months out of the year to work on the railroads while my children and I stay on the farm taking care of all of our animals and tending our garden. When my husband comes back, it is honestly such a relief since he's able to do work on the more hands-on, bigger projects around the property. Well, our family had been lacking something for the first year on the property. We have no water running to the shed that we currently live in. Yes, shed. We converted a 12 by 30 foot shed into a small cabin for the kids and my husband and I. It's fine, it does the trick. Keeps us dry during the wet months and keeps us warm during the cold months. But what has always bothered me has been the lack of a toilet. For the first year, we'd literally just been going out into the woods with a roll of biodegradable toilet paper, and I was so sick of it. Ever tried getting a 2-year-old to go to the bathroom where everything around them has their attention and not you? It's impossible. So to remedy this situation, I asked my very handy husband to build us an outhouse. Nothing fancy, just a small building where we could go to the bathroom in peace. He was absolutely on board and positive that he could do it. Our shed fortunately had electricity powered by our diesel generator just outside, so my husband spent a whole week researching exactly what he needed to build the outhouse and how he was going to do it. He even bought a new, very expensive chainsaw just so he could cut down one of our trees himself to use the wood. I didn't really like the sound of that since I thought it sounded dangerous, but he was so sure that he could do it because he loved to remind me that he's cut down plenty of trees before, so this time shouldn't be a problem. I decided to trust that he knew what he was doing. The day came for him to cut down the tree, and to say that I was nervous would have been an understatement. I stayed in the shed with our daughters and patiently waited for him to come inside and tell me that the tree was down and that it was done and over with. I heard his chainsaw roar to life and the awful sound of it cutting through the wood. I took comfort in knowing that one of our neighbors had come by to help him, so at least he wouldn't be alone. The loud thump of the tree heightened my anxiety for a second, and when I looked out the window and saw the big smile on my husband's face and a thumbs up, I knew it was okay. I decided to stand out on the small porch just outside the door of our shed to watch him chop it down. For about an hour, everything seemed to be going fine. Now, I know nothing about chainsaws or cutting down trees, so I can only describe to you what I saw and the way that I saw it. My husband and our neighbor were both chopping up the tree on different ends when I noticed my husband was having a hard time getting through this specific part of the tree, more towards what used to be the bottom of the trunk. I watched in horror as I saw him prop his leg up onto the trunk of the tree to get more leverage, and I screamed at him to stop. Of course, they couldn't hear me since both my husband and our neighbor were wearing ear protection. I started running towards them to hopefully stop my husband from possibly hurting himself, but there was nothing I could do. I was at least 100 feet away and I just wasn't fast enough. As I was running and screaming for my husband to stop, I watched him place the chainsaw against the bark once more, only this time when it kicked back, there wasn't just an open space for it to go into. There was his leg. The chain ripped through his shin, and blood immediately sprayed and oozed from the wound. He screamed in pain and threw the chainsaw to the ground. Our neighbor just looked at us with wide eyes, and I screamed at him to get help. I rushed to my husband's side, and I honestly had no idea what to do. I was panicking, he was panicking, and it was pure chaos. I looked at his leg, and through all the blood, I could just see mangled flesh. My husband had begun to scream. There was literally no stopping the wailing coming from his mouth, and I wasn't going to ask him to stop. I could only imagine the fear and pain that he must have been feeling. I thought for a second and remembered a YouTube video that I had watched on how to make a tourniquet out of a piece of your clothing. Without thinking twice, I used a knife to cut a piece of cloth from my flannel. I positioned it above the wound on my husband's leg and tied it tight. I used a nearby stick and tied it to the piece of cloth and twisted it over and over as tightly as possible to hopefully cut off blood circulation to the lower half of his leg. He had already lost so much blood, and I was scared when I realized his screams got quieter with each breath that he took. Our neighbor came back with his wife, and she was carrying what looked to be a first aid kit. They informed us that they had called 911 and an ambulance was on its way, but wouldn't be there for another 30 or even possibly 45 minutes, and the number one thing they said to do was to make sure it bled as little as possible. From what I could tell, the tourniquet I had made was working, but my husband wasn't doing any better. His screaming had stopped and he was finally able to talk to me. He said that he felt numb and his body was cold. We brought him blankets, and all I could do was sit with him and wait for the ambulance to get there. He was telling me over and over again how scared he was, and I was trying to be brave for him, but my God, I was terrified. I needed him. Our kids needed him, and I should have never let him cut up that tree. Wind had started to roll in, and dirt started getting in the wound. I didn't really know what to do, but it seemed like a good idea at the time to at least cover his leg with something. I grabbed a clean towel from the shed and told him to brace himself for me to place it on his leg. I very gently wrapped the towel around what was left of the lower portion of his leg, and surprisingly, he said that he didn't feel much down there anymore. His face became white and he got colder and colder. By the time the ambulance arrived, he had been in and out of consciousness for about 10 minutes. I called my mom to come and pick up the kids, and our neighbors watched them until she got there. I rode with my husband to the hospital. He had lost so much blood, and at first, doctors weren't sure if he was going to make it. They did end up having to amputate his leg below the knee. Unfortunately, he developed an infection post-surgery and needed a second amputation 2 weeks later, and this time above the knee, and he was devastated. He thought life as he knew it was over. To him, his purpose in life was doing activities he thought he could no longer do without his leg. He's still going through his journey of recovery, but is doing much better mentally. He's determined to do everything he once did before the accident, and for now, we're staying with my mother in the city while he heals. I'm just glad that day didn't end with the loss of my husband and my children's father. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't have a sloppy mud pie.
Let me preface this by saying that I work in a well-populated town with a low crime rate, and no reason to outright assume any of these actions were what I later found out to be trafficking attempts. So I work at a popular coffee chain, generally doing afternoon closing shifts. This night in particular, we had a very young crew for closing, which happens at 10:30 p.m. For reference too, we have our shift lead, 19, female. Her name is Sarah. Myself, 17 female, my co-worker, 17 female, her name is Mia, and another co-worker, 18 and female, her name is Dee. Now, it had been a relatively slow night, with only a few loyal regulars dropping by. Both drive-through and the cafe were pretty much empty, as heavy rainfall had started and no one wanted to be out. I was in the front of the store cleaning while the rest of my co-workers were in the back of the store, when an older man walks in. He wore odd clothing, a bit strange for the humid weather, a full black attire with combat boots, a heavy red jacket, and a beanie on his head obscuring his hair. I brushed it off as protection from the storm and figured that he worked outside, and went to ask if he had placed an online order as he stood at the mobile counter. Putting on my customer service voice, I smiled and went through my standard spiel, but was alarmed when instead of responding, he places a bag on the counter and starts pulling out DVDs. Once he finishes pulling out a stack of 10 or so, he stares past me into the back room where my co-workers were obliviously chatting, and then makes a sort of lap around the store, eyeing me the entire time, not speaking a word. He backs out of the front door and walks out to his truck, which I now see is a large black pickup. Freaking out now, I stupidly grab the stack of DVDs and run back to my co-workers. They're immediately alarmed by my demeanor and ask me what's wrong. I hold out the DVDs and let them inspect them while I explain what happened. Much to my discomfort, Sarah points out that all of the movies are about either murders or kidnappings. Slightly ticked off by this and extremely uncomfortable, we make the decision to call my manager. He picks up, and Sarah explains the situation, while I comfort Dee and Mia, who are freaked out, probably more so than I am at this time. He tells us that there's nothing that we can do about it, but to call back if anything else happens. So we hang up and move back to the front of the store as a group. Things pretty much go on as usual as well, but with an air of fear about us, I guess. Mia sticks to my side and Dee to Sarah's. The man's truck had pulled off at that point, but much to my dismay, had only pulled into the now closed grocery store next door that had a clear view into the drive-through window. A few cars pulled through the drive-through, and I even had a few customers ask if I was alright, due to my, what I assumed to be terrified face. I've always had a pretty good intuition about things, and this felt more wrong than anything else I'd ever felt. A bit more time passes though, and it's now time for Dee to leave. With the man still in the parking lot next door, we decided that it would probably be best for her boyfriend, Daniel, to come and pick her up. This wasn't an irregular occurrence too, and we didn't want him following her home. Mia then points out that a van had been sitting in the back of the parking lot for almost an hour at that point, which we had not noticed previously. Another gut feeling hits at this point, and I make the decision to lock the door. Daniel tells her that he's on the way, and I inform my manager that we close the cafe for peace of mind, which he was fine with as business was slow anyway. Now, Sarah and Dee are in the back, and Mia and I are up front. I go about cleaning the machines and trying to make idle chatter to keep her calm, which is no small feat, let me tell you, as she jumps every time she hears someone steaming milk. As we're talking, and I have my back turned to her, she screams mid-sentence, "Get out!" Alarmed, I whip around to where she is standing near the counter, close to the drive-through window, and saw her pointing to a shadowy figure climbing through that window. The next few moments were just a blur of adrenaline-rushed thinking and what I can only explain is extreme divine intervention. It genuinely cannot be explained by anything other than some grand divine plan to keep myself and my co-workers alive. But grabbing her arm, I yank Mia behind me and grab the hot bucket of sanitizer that I had been using to scrub the counters around the machines with. I throw the liquid onto him, simultaneously pushing the man out the window, which he had only had his shoulders through, with a big red bucket now on his head. If you work in food service, you know the ones. Bulky things. At the same time, Daniel pulls up outside. Mia is now yelling for someone to call the police, and I see Dee in my peripheral running outside to our new saviour. I slam the drive-through windows shut and lock them, with the man still laying on the ground struggling to get his bearings. I couldn't tell you how much time passed, although it couldn't have been more than like 50 to 30 seconds before I see Daniel rush the man who was now on his knees and pin him to the ground. Sarah and Mia were now pulling me to the back of the store, with both fighting back sobs and Sarah on the phone with the police. Thankfully, we have some awesome regulars who are also deputies that arrived within 5 minutes of our call and arrested the man. The aftermath was messy, but they eventually pinned him as a member of a local trafficking ring that had been caught years prior and let out on bail. Oh yeah, and the van in the back that had kept Dee from leaving in the first place, it hightailed it out of the parking lot in the middle of all the action, but was eventually traced back to people who were also a part of that ring. Even though I won't be releasing names or such as legal proceedings are still happening, I figured that I would tell my story here, and I still work there and am very grateful for Daniel, who very well could have saved all of our lives in that moment. He managed to keep the man pinned the entire time until the police arrived and disarmed him. He really is the true hero of this story, although I do pride myself on quick thinking for getting him out of the store. Anyway, moral of the story, trust your gut feelings, and always have a steaming hot bucket of sanitizer on hand. Oh, and the DVDs? I should probably mention their relevance other than scaring everyone. The police did check them out during the investigation, which is technically ongoing, but found that they were blank. In my terms of terrible explanation, to them it looked like he burned blank DVDs, but unsuccessfully, so whatever was supposed to be on them didn't stick, allegedly. But they weren't the original DVDs. We never bothered to open them when they were in our hands anyway. But a part of me thinks that the police, they may be lying to me about it to hide the fact that there was something really bad on them. But I try not to think about all of that too much. So, they lived in Connecticut, and it's where I grew up. This happened when I was like 14. It was either right after Ed Warren passed away or not too long after. Me and my dad, we were staying at my aunt's house one night. It was a two-family house, so her and my uncle, as well as my cousin, her husband and their 2 children, they all lived there. It was a new house they had just built and moved in a couple of months back. I found this part out later, by the way. But leading up to that night, my aunt was having crazy dreams where a little boy would appear in her dreams every night, or so she thought they were dreams, and let her out of bed. My aunt said that the outside of the house was a very bright light that shone through the windows to the point where she couldn't see anything outside, and the little boy would try to lead her outside. But my aunt would always be found in the morning by my uncle around the house, passed out on the bathroom floor, the living room, even the garage one time. They just assumed that my aunt was sleepwalking. So, anyway, that night at about 2 a.m. or so, everyone hears this loud screaming coming from the upstairs living room. Me and my dad and my aunt and uncle all wake up and run upstairs because it sounded like somebody was hurt. We get up there, and my cousin and her husband are in the living room, and my cousin's son, who was about 2 years younger than me, was sitting in a rocking chair. His back was to us, but my cousin and husband were freaking out. So my dad and my uncle walked over to my cousin and went to see what was wrong. My uncle touched his shoulder, and he turned his head around and it was bright red. His eyes were bloodshot and his skin was starting to turn this weird greyish colour. When they tried asking him what was wrong, he started speaking in another language and was rocking in the chair back and forth. Now, he was known as a kind of prankster of a kid, so my uncle and my cousin's husband, thinking that he was playing around, yelled at him to stop and went to grab him out of the chair. But when they touched him that time, he let out a huge scream, again in another language of some sort, and his eyes started to roll in the back of his head. We all started freaking out at this point, not knowing what to do. My cousin went and got a glass of water, thinking that maybe he was sleepwalking, and threw it on him, and he just laughed in this really creepy and sort of deeper voice. My aunt was a pretty holy woman. She would keep crosses and angel statues and even holy water in the house, so she ran back downstairs to get the holy water because at this point, we realized something weird was going on. My dad and my uncle grabbed him out of the chair. He was kicking and trying to fight them the whole time and held him on the floor. My aunt brings over the holy water and rubs it in her hands. My cousin lifts up his shirt while he's being held down, and my aunt places her hand on his back, and it literally burnt him. In fact, it left a burn mark the exact size of her hand on his back. He screamed and screamed for a couple of seconds before he ended up just passing out. I'm just standing there the whole time, absolutely terrified, not moving and just watching all of this happen. So he's passed out and not knowing what to do, they call the police. It's probably around 3 a.m. at this point. So the police come with the paramedics and talk to us all, and the meds check out my second cousin to see if he's okay. He ended up waking up and they said that he was fine, save for still having the burn mark on his back. Not knowing what to do, the police recommended that they give Mrs. Warren a call since she was a famous paranormal investigator and lives right in CT. So nobody ends up going to bed at all that night, and me and my dad leave in the late morning. Now, this next part I wasn't there for, but about a week later my aunt gives Mrs. Warren a call, tells her about what happened, and invites her to the house. Apparently Lorraine knew what the house was about before she even stepped foot in there. Apparently the newly built house was built on land that housed some kind of a portal to the other dimension or something. I don't know, but the little boy in my aunt's dream was trying to lead my aunt outside through this portal apparently, because if a human entered the portal, it would be open enough for demons to constantly go through. Apparently one got through and was able to possess my second cousin because he wasn't strong enough to fight it. Well, Lorraine ends up doing this whole seance and cleansing of the house to get rid of it all and close it permanently. And they ended up living in that house for about another 8 years without any problems ever again before selling it and moving out of state. I never did stay over there again though, and to this day, that night, it still haunts me. This is another good old story from South Africa. As people from there know too, there's a lot of game farms, lodges, etc., especially around the area of Kruger National Park. This incident took place in a very tranquil 4-star game farm close to the southern tip of the above-mentioned Kruger National Park as well. So, we frequented the lodge often over the 5 years before this incident, as it was a favourite with me and my wife, then girlfriend. The lodge had a very nice central area with pool, restaurant, etc., and then the tents were spread out around, with the furthest one about maybe a kilometre from the restaurant. The chalets were very private and set up in the bush, so you could not see the next one over, and could only hear your neighbours if they were really loud. Sadly, the lodge has fallen on hard times and has gone backwards a bit. The weekend this incident took place, only 2 of the 25-plus units were occupied for the Friday night, and we were the only ones there for the Saturday night. It did make me feel a little bit uneasy, if I'm being honest. But to make matters worse, The lodge or the farm manager came by on Saturday morning saying that he's leaving the farm for the weekend. If we need anything, to just help ourselves in the restaurant fridges, then leave a note, and then we can settle the bill next week. Sure, no problem. We have the pool and the jacuzzi all to ourselves. We left to go for a visit to the KNP after the manager left and stayed out most of the day. We got back around 3 p.m. and as we got out of the car, I just got goosebumps. It was 35 degrees Celsius out, like over 100 Fahrenheit, so I definitely didn't get cold or anything. As we approached, we parked about 150 meters from the place that we were staying and had a little path that we walked down. And as we approached, I noticed big shoe prints over mine and my girlfriend's prints from this morning. That seriously put me on edge. I approached the place that we were staying and noticed the prints turn around and walk back the way that they came, but everything seemed in order. We went for a swim and a bit of a game drive around the farm and returned at around 5:30, started to make the fire, barbecue the meat, and prepare some other food. Both me and my girlfriend seemed on edge though, and we were just really quiet. We sat down to eat at around 8 p.m. and as we sat down, I looked at my girlfriend. She looked worried. I asked her what was wrong, and she said that she was having a bad feeling and that we should go. I said that I felt the same and we need to leave now, not after we ate, but right then. So we chucked our food in the cooler, grabbed our bags, and we ran to the car, jumped in, and almost raced out of there. As we went out the gate, we dropped the keys in the box and drove away, and the feeling of dread slowly went away. We made the 150-kilometer, almost 100-mile drive home in the dark and slept in our own bed. We woke up on Sunday and went about our day as normal. At about 4 p.m. that afternoon, though, my phone rings and I see it's the number from the lodge manager. I answer and he frantically asks if we're okay, and I say, yeah, of course, why? He starts explaining and my veins go ice cold. Apparently, the lodge was broken into and ransacked this Saturday night. They took everything of value and what they could not take, they destroyed. It was a group of 5 men that did it, and apparently there was no evidence that they ransacked any chalets as well. Only one. The one that my girlfriend and I were booked into. The one that we would have been sleeping in had we not left so abruptly the previous night. So, that means that they were watching us. The lodge had cameras, but the chalet did not, and we left just after 8 p.m, probably about 8:10 when we had everything in the car and started driving. And at about 8:20 when we left the farm, as it was about 2 kilometers from the lodge to the gate down to a gravel road, the cameras caught the first signs of movement at the lodge just before 8:30, and at least one was visibly armed with a firearm in the footage, and a few had machetes. I shudder to think what would have happened had we have been there. The nearest people would have been like over 3 kilometers away in a straight line, and we were completely alone on that farm. There was only a little bit of cell reception to at the lodge and none where we were staying. In other words, there was no way that we would have been able to call for help. Needless to say, we did not go to lodges or isolated areas for a long time after that. And sadly, the lodge and the farm went under not long after this, and I saw ads that it was being sold on a bank auction. That incident, it shocked us both quite a bit, and we vowed to always trust our instincts and intuition after it, and to tell each other if something felt off. We both have had that uneasy feeling since about 3 that afternoon when we came back, and the reason neither of us said anything was because we didn't want to spoil the weekend for the other. And that almost cost us, possibly, the ultimate price. So, the lesson that we learned here is to trust your gut. Trust your partner's gut feeling too. If something feels off, it's probably because it is. And it may just save your life, like it did for us. Back in the late 2000s, I had just finished my useless degree and was struggling to find work. I was living in a Midwestern college town where everyone and their dog had some higher level education, so it wasn't uncommon to find people with PhDs working for like $10 an hour at a cashier, but the town was cute and affordable, so people liked to stay post-graduation. I found a decent job at a coffee shop over the summer, but once the fall semester started, my hours were cut and I was replaced with cheaper, younger baristas. A co-worker suggested that I start nannying. I wasn't particularly interested in working with kids, but she assured me that it was good money, and so I decided to join a website for nannies and babysitters, and very quickly was contacted by a family. I met the parents for a quick interview and was hired fairly quickly. The pay was excellent and the hours were great, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., so I had the evenings to myself and free weekends. Both parents were professors at the local university, and they had 2 children and were expecting their third very soon. Henry was 8 and Jane was 3. Both children were incredibly intelligent, Jane particularly so, and had the vocabulary of a much older child. I was primarily responsible for her, since Henry spent most of his day in school. Jane was a very serious little girl, though. She could carry on very in-depth conversations, and I used to joke with her that she was like a 60-year-old trapped in a toddler's body. Henry, though, Henry was a beautiful kid, I'll give him that. He had thick, dark, curly hair, long eyelashes, piercing blue eyes, and dimples. He has the ability to be sweet, loving, and funny, but I quickly learned that this was a skill set that he only used when it benefited him. Overall, Henry was a true monster. Now, I have an older brother and 2 younger brothers, so I'm familiar with sibling relationships, and I know fighting is normal. But Henry, he tormented Jane. I've never seen a child get so much joy out of causing pain, fear, and discomfort to another human being. He loved nothing more than to terrify her with stories or monsters or ghosts. He had convinced Jane that there was a demon living in their basement, and she refused to go down with me when I had to do the laundry. Over a couple of weeks, I had slowly got her to sit on the bathroom step and play while I folded clothes so I could keep an eye on her. She was proud of her bravery too, but when Henry came home and saw that she had conquered her fears, he made it his duty to terrify her even more, and all progress was soon lost. He was so terribly mean to his little sister that I was worried about her physical safety when he was home. He would constantly taunt her, pinch her, threaten her, and destroy her belongings. I despised the hour that I had with him every evening after picking him up from school. The entire time would be filled with crying and screaming and his refusal to obey anything that I asked him to do. I would try to tell him off occasionally. I'd say that he couldn't act however he wished, that he was a child, I was the adult, etc. I would say, "You aren't the king of this castle, Henry." This is my parents used to say to me. And he would say, "I am the king. I'm King Henry. Off with your head." He would always respond like that, and he was pretty much right. I didn't have any less control over him than his parents, too. They, Elizabeth and Michael, were absolutely clueless. Dad was work-obsessed and incredibly hands-off. Mum was a sweetheart, but also a doormat, and allowed both kids to just walk all over her. They had no discipline whatsoever, so a lot of Henry's behaviors, they sort of made sense. Why would he need to behave if no one ever made him? I was shocked to watch how Henry treated his mother, though, and how she allowed him to mock her, call her names, and act aggressively towards her. It wasn't unusual for him to tell her that she looked ugly and needed to go change or put her hair down, and she'd always go and do it. He threatened to punch her stomach if she didn't do what he wanted. He'd pinch her in the back of her arms when she displeased him. She made excuse after excuse for his behavior, calling him exceptionally bright and bored and having a difficult time adjusting to her pregnancy. When the baby was born, though, things got even worse. Thankfully, he didn't attempt to hurt baby Peggy, but his aggression and violence towards his mother and Jane got so much worse. One afternoon, he found his mum's sewing needles and tried to trick Jane into sitting on one. When it didn't work, he just stuck one right into her tiny arm. She screamed, and I freaked out and removed it and called both parents ASAP. Elizabeth arrived home, concerned for Jane, and for the first time seemed at least frustrated by Henry's behavior. She attempted to scold him, and he became so enraged, though, that he started punching her in her newly postpartum stomach. She only responded by crying and hugging him and asking him why he was so angry and wanted to hurt his sister. He responded with a cold, "I'm angry because you should have miscarried them both. They both should have died inside of you." My jaw must have hit the floor that day. Elizabeth stopped crying and just stared at him, and then me. I assumed that they were going to potentially get this kid some help, but when I approached the subject the next day, I was brushed off and told that they had had a talk with Henry and it was just an outburst due to an unrelated issue at school. Another excuse, really. Henry continued to torment the entire family, but then he started to target me as well. For the past few months, he mostly ignored me. He'd occasionally call me ugly or throw the laundry I'd just folded all over the room, but he had yet to get physical with me. But this all changed one day when I unfortunately had the day off from school, so I got to spend the entire day with him home, while also caring for Jane and Peggy. It was challenging, but by 10 a.m., he was bored of torturing Jane and went to go and play in his room. The rest of the morning went decently, with him occupied in his room until lunch, where he spilled his plate all over the table because I didn't cut his crust the right way. I just cleaned it up. I had admitted my defeat weeks ago anyway. I couldn't enforce any rules or boundaries if the parents didn't back me up. But I put the girls down for a nap, and Henry asked me to read him a story. For the first time, too, he was calm and genuinely sweet with me. I read him the BFG, and he cuddles a bit closer. I thought for a bit that maybe this kid just really needs more one-on-one time. I was about 30 minutes into the book when I felt a small hand reach under my skirt and touch my stomach. I looked at him and he stared at me. I gently picked up his hand and told him that it wasn't appropriate to touch other people without asking. He seemed angry, but let me continue reading. I noticed that he had stopped paying attention to the story and was sort of looking me all over. Before I could ask him what was wrong, his hand was under my shirt and making his way for my breast when I yanked it away and stood up. I tried not to yell, told him that that was incredibly inappropriate and that he's never to touch anyone underneath their clothes ever again like that. Henry looked at me and then he said, "I can touch whoever I want, wherever I want, whenever I want. You can't stop me, and no one can stop me." I was creeped out, obviously, and felt violated. I know that he was just a kid, but just imagine how that feels as an adult woman. I know children aren't the best with personal space boundaries, but Henry was almost 9 now, and I knew that he knew what he did wasn't appropriate or okay. The intent behind it, honestly, seemed sinister. I ended our story session quickly after that, and I tried to get through the rest of the day. I was really glad that he'd be back at school for the rest of the week, but I did decide to let his mother know because it felt weird not to. She thought that it was funny, though. She kind of chuckled and said that he's a very sensory-orientated kid and it was just trying to be affectionate or something. At that point, I honestly decided that I was never going to talk sense into these parents and I needed to look for another job quickly. I knew that I was going to put my 2 weeks in pretty soon. I was very sad because I was close to Jane and Peggy and felt like I was abandoning them, but I had discussed Henry's behavior with my roommate, and she was concerned about potential legal ramifications for me if Henry did something to one of the girls on my watch. I came back to work on Monday, and Jane, she had a black eye. Henry had accidentally punched her in the eye during an argument. I was really sad for her, and I asked her what happened later, and she told me that she was playing in her room when Henry came in, took her doll, and when she tried to grab it back, he punched her square in the eye and just laughed at her. Henry was so evil at home, though, that I wondered why his teacher never seemed to mention any behavioral issues in the classroom. One evening, though, while picking her up, I mentioned Henry was very difficult at home and wondered if she had any issues with him at school. She said no, that he was actually very well behaved, had no issues, and had a lot of friends, in fact. I was really surprised by that. I assumed Henry was disturbed and that his poor behavior just transferred into class. But the teacher denied all of this. I quite frankly didn't believe her, so one afternoon the girls and I left early and arrived at his school so I could see how he interacted. But she was completely right. He sat at his desk quietly, raised his hand, seemed genuinely friendly to his peers. And for some reason, this stark difference in Henry's personality from home to school really terrified me, even more than normal. Initially, I thought that he was just a disturbed kid, but at that moment, I realized how truly in control he was. Henry wasn't just an angry child with severe behavioral issues. Henry was just a mean person who knew when and where he could get away with his favorite pastime, causing misery. Thankfully, I managed to find an entry-level position in a field related to my degree in spring. I have my 2 weeks, and Elizabeth was upset, but she understood. Henry, however, was absolutely livid. He made sure to tell me daily how much he hated me and how glad he was that I was leaving and how he hoped that I would die. I was feeling less than patient with his antics, so sometimes I replied a little more sarcastically than I should have to a 9-year-old child. But on my last day, Friday, my treat to Elizabeth and Michael was to let them have a date night. I picked up Henry from school at 2:55 and we headed home. Henry refuses to talk to me. He wouldn't even look at me. He wouldn't even acknowledge me. I thought that may not be the worst way to spend the next 6 hours, to be honest, when it happened, but we arrived home, and shortly after, Elizabeth and Michael came in and started to get ready for their date. The baby was about 5 months old at this point, and they hadn't been out since her birth the fall before. Typical Henry refused to speak to anyone, and Elizabeth got worried and thought about cancelling the date, not wanting to see Henry upset, but I wrongly assured her that things would be fine, and they left around 6 p.m. The older two went to bed at around 8 p.m, and the baby an hour before, so I only had to make it about maybe 2 more hours with Henry. We ordered pizza. He refused to eat. He just sat there and sulked in his chair. I let them watch about 30 minutes of the Magic School Bus on my laptop, a treat since they didn't own a TV, while I bathed the baby, gave her a bottle, and put her down in her crib. And quite honestly, I was pretty surprised I didn't even hear a peep coming from downstairs. No crying or screaming, and I felt a bit victorious that Henry was so stubborn in his silent treatment that he didn't even realize how easy he was making this evening. When I got into the living room, I then noticed that Henry had a sly grin on his face. The first one that I had seen all day. I let the episode finish. I took the computer and noticed it was incredibly sticky. I quickly realized that it was honey and that Henry had gone into the kitchen and put a solid glob in his hands and rubbed it all over the bottom of the back of the computer. I was just relieved, though, that he didn't get the keyboard, to be honest. I took it into the kitchen, though, and wiped it off, and then I heard Jane scream. I ran into the living room, and Henry was sat there with Jane right next to him, with her hand squeezed tightly with his right hand, and one of the kitchen knives in the other hand. I froze. I demanded that he put the knife down immediately and let his sister go. I told him that this wasn't funny and that he'd crossed a line. He, on the other hand, just smiled. I went to grab Jane, and she cried, and Henry just chuckled. He said, "I really scared you. You know, I could have killed her while you were upstairs, and you would have never known." The blood drained from my face. The anger that I felt towards him turned into fear, and then the realization that, you know what, he was right. I felt really stupid. I rarely left them alone together because it usually ended in Jane being pinched, pushed, slapped, or bit, but I guess that I let my guard down given his docile behavior all day. I just started to cry and screamed at him to never ever do that again, and to go straight to his room. He just sat and stared and went to the kitchen and put the knife back, and then quietly went upstairs. I was obviously super shaken up and was still trying to calm down as I bathed Jane and got her ready for bed. I told her that I was sorry and asked if he had hurt her, and she said that he hadn't. I was about as angry with myself as I was at him. I could see Henry in his room playing with his Hot Wheels set, and I told him that he needed to have the lights out by 8:30 and that he could tuck himself in. He stared at me and shut the door to his room, and I prayed that that would be the last time that I saw him for the night. I got Jane into bed and was reading her a story when I heard his door creak open. I got up and it looked as if he had creaked the door, but the lights were off. I continued reading until I suddenly heard Peggy start to gently cry, but she sounded close. I immediately sprung up, and outside the doorframe, I could see Henry holding the baby over the banister. I couldn't even scream. I've never moved so fast in my life. I got to Peggy quickly, and I grabbed her, and I just ran back into Janie's room. I shut the door, and I shouted at Henry, asking him why he would do this, which was a stupid question. I knew why. To torment me. To make me realize how easily he could access his younger sisters and potentially hurt them. Henry could have dropped Peggy, and he could have hurt Jane with that knife, but he didn't. And I don't think that was ever the intention. He just wanted to let me know that I wasn't doing my job nearly as well as I thought, and that in the end, he was the one, always in control. It took a while to calm myself down and the girls and get them to sleep. It was close to 9 by that time, and I left their bedrooms and saw that Henry was still up in his room, reading on his bed. And at that, I just kind of looked at him. I was so relieved that this was my last day dealing with this kid and all of his terrible antics, but I also felt really sad and scared for his sisters. I told him that it was time for bed and that I was going to tell his parents about what had happened. He didn't respond. I turned out the lights, and then I heard him call my name. And he said, "You can tell them, but it's a waste of your time. You're just lucky. You're really lucky. I can do what I want. I can hurt who I want. I can touch who I want. You're all really lucky." And at that, I just shut the door and left. Elizabeth and Michael came home a little later than expected, and they paid me. I didn't mention what happened that night because it felt, pointless, but the next day I ended up sending a text. I got a long response from Elizabeth full of excuses about Henry like normal, and she even insinuated that I lied. And I was over it. I was over all of them. And yes, I did end up contacting CPS, but I'm not sure if anything ever came of it. I don't believe that Henry was being abused or anything. I've told this story to others and people always ask me that, but no, I don't think that was the cause. I honestly think that Henry was born a sociopath, and his parents were enablers who never made him accountable for his actions, and the two together created a monster. I didn't hear from them for over a decade. I moved across the country. I'm married now and I have kids. My son is almost 6 years of age and he has 2 little sisters that are 3. They fight, but he loves them and is really protective and knows what a healthy relationship between siblings should look like. Anyways, a few weeks ago I got a friend request on Facebook from Elizabeth. She looks the same, a few more lines, but still very elegant and pretty. Her profile picture consists of herself and her now 4 children. I glanced across the photo until my eye caught a young man with thick curly hair and bright blue eyes. It was Henry. Henry ended up as stunning looking as expected. He's about to be a sophomore at a well-known elite American university. He plays for their soccer team and is majoring in business. He has a girlfriend and seems popular in his fraternity. And this is all I can gather through his public Facebook posts. Who knows? Maybe he learned accountability and grew out of his mean-spirited and manipulative way. I can only hope that that's true for his siblings' sake, as well as the well-being of those around him. For now, though, my family is thousands of miles away from Henry, and I honestly don't care if I ever see him again. But if I ever do, I handled him then, and I'll definitely handle him again. This was about 4 years ago. I went over to my friend's house for my first sleepover there, ever. And quite honestly, I was dreading it, as I suffer from extreme separation anxiety, so I was already nervous. But it started off normal. My friend and I were basically just chatting all night. Though at about 11:30 at night, we heard the kitchen door open. But we were sleeping in a room connected to the kitchen, so if you were standing in the kitchen, you could see us. In walks my friend's dad, and he stood there to see if we were awake, and like any 12-year-old, we would pretend that we were asleep. Once his dad was sure that we were asleep again, we saw him open the pantry door and step inside, leaving a small gap, just big enough to look out and watch us. Both me and my friend saw this, and after about 15 minutes of dead silence, I whispered to my friend asking what his dad was doing. He said that he wasn't sure and that he'd never done this before. After about 45 minutes of him staying in there, me and my friend started having doubts about what we saw, so I volunteered to go and get myself a drink of water, which I would need to walk past the pantry to do. I got up and I walked past the door and sneakily looked inside as I walked past. And sure enough, he was still standing in there. I went back and told my friend, and we both just lied there in silence until about 10 minutes later, the pantry door opens and he walks out and goes to bed. Me and my friend were really freaked out, but eventually we fell asleep from tiredness. We both remember it though, and I have slept there since, but he's never done the same thing since then. In fact, his dad has always been really nice. And I guess that this leaves me to wonder, since it was so dark, if it was actually his dad at all. Maybe it was somebody else.
Tales from the Break Room is a podcast about allegedly true scary workplace stories. These stories are sent to us by listeners. If you want your story narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Sorry, I'm just sort of out of it today. You see, people like to share their scariest work stories with me, right? Well, I heard one the other day that has absolutely boggled my mind. I mean, this story was so rough. My innocence grew back just so the story could rip it away from me again. And you know what? I'm gonna share it with you today. Skip your coffee and grab your booster seat. This is gonna be a disturbing one. My good friend Niall, who you might recognize from Oni Plays and Sleepy Cabin, joins me for a story today. I'll also be adding an old story I've told on unexplained encounters, which fits here pretty well, so you might recognize it. These are Tales from the Break Room. Warning: the following story contains harsh depictions of violence against pets. Cynthia. From Officer Nobody. I'm a young police officer in a southern city. As a child, it was my dream to become one. I made tinfoil badges and carved sticks to look like pistols. I took reports with crayons and chased imaginary criminals. 20 or so years later, I average 3 hours of sleep and have grueling anxiety attacks. Like my peers, I've seen terrible things. It's what we signed up for, so I don't expect sympathy. In 2018, I responded to a welfare check where I found a 2-week-old decomposed body. The man had hanged himself with copper wire inside a closet. His skin was so rotted that it separated where the wire attached. It was an unwanted but gnarly anatomy lesson. It was mid-June, so the smell was unbearable. But hey, dead bodies were a dime a dozen. In 2019, I helped scrape a woman from the pavement following a crash. Her survived husband watched from a distance. But hey, I dealt with hysterical loved ones weekly. In 2020, I watched a homeless man burn alive inside a shed. He had locked the door from the inside and couldn't find the key. The window was too narrow to climb out of. His space heater had caught fire. But hey, the fire marshal took the report. I don't mean to sound callous or smug. I only want to depict reality. The truth is, as disgusting as those stories are, they are not the reason behind my insomnia. They are not the reason for my anxiety. Frankly, I hardly think about them. My trauma comes from 2021, where I responded to a call that haunts me every second. It was around 3 a.m. I was typing a larceny report in my car while Ozark played in the background. It was the scene where Wendy's lover gets thrown off a building and goes splat in front of Marty. Crazy scene. It was a mid-80s summer night amongst a full moon. By that time, everything was calm. The night shift was short-handed, so my typical beat partner wasn't working. Dispatch requested me for a welfare check. Welfare checks are usually harmless, although it is when you find the most dead bodies. Welfare checks are what they sound like, checking the welfare of a person and ensuring they're okay. The reporting party is usually a family member who couldn't get a hold of the person. I received this information and began driving. I was tasked with checking the welfare of an elderly woman who lived alone on the outskirts of town, barely within city limits. Her granddaughter lived a few states away and hadn't heard from her. She assumed that her grandma accidentally switched her cell phone to silent, as she often did. Dispatch usually sends 2 officers, but every now and again they'll give an officer an option to take the call alone. Because of staffing levels and the nature of the call, I decided to handle it myself. Worst case scenario, Granny bit the dust and I would call a medical examiner to work an unattended death. I drove a good 15 minutes to the residence. Another 100 feet north and it would have been county jurisdiction. Lucky me, right? There were no other houses in the area. It was so quiet that the sound of gravel under my tires was thunderous. Beyond the mailbox was a locked gate and a long dirt driveway. I absolutely did not want to walk that driveway alone in the dark without my patrol car. I grabbed my radio to call for another officer, but changed my mind. I would have looked silly asking for help after committing to doing it solo. Plus, it would have been an even longer drive for them. I decided to man up, jump the gate, and make what turned out to be the worst decision in my life. If it wasn't for the moonlight, it would have been so dark that I couldn't see my feet. I was trained to be tactical with my flashlight, only using it in short bursts. It was a good way to be sneaky. I finally reached the house and stood in front of it. It was an old wooden home with 2 stories. Every window was pitch black, besides one on the second floor, and had a purple curtain with white stripes. I stepped on the unstable wraparound porch and listened carefully. There was nothing but absolute silence. No TV, no creaks, no fans, nothing. Tentatively, I knocked and announced myself. There was no answer and no noise. I knocked even louder and announced again. Still nothing. I stepped off the porch to reevaluate the situation. Once far enough, I looked up to the second story. The light was off. Typically, something like that wouldn't creep me out, but the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. Since the light was off, I couldn't see whether someone was looking back at me. I had a terrifying feeling that they were. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it in through the window. No one was standing there, but the curtain had moved and was still swaying. I went back to the door and knocked even louder, telling her who I was and why I was there. "Cynthia, it's Officer Blank with the Blank Police Department. I'm just checking your welfare." I stood there for several minutes in eerie silence. I was ready to hightail it back to the road, but figured I'd wait another minute. I had done my job for the most part. I was there to make sure she wasn't dead. If she wanted to ignore me, fine. I was creeped out, and without a partner, I wasn't going to press the issue. For some reason, before walking away, I decided to try the doorknob. This isn't usual practice, since it could be deemed a violation of the Fourth Amendment. I couldn't enter the home without a warrant, exigent circumstances, or permission. To my surprise and regret, the door opened. Apparently, the heavy wooden door needed its hinges tightened because it slowly opened all the way until it knocked against the wall. I shined my light inside. It was definitely an old woman's residence. Everything was lavender and tidy. There were creepy portraits of hairless cats on the walls. There were also statues of them. I reached my hand inside to flick on the light, but it didn't activate. At first, I thought the house had no power. There were no sounds of electricity at all, and it was hotter than a sauna with no airflow. Then I remembered the light upstairs. The whole situation was odd and unsettling. I decided to dial my supervisor to get his opinion. I was hoping he would tell me to leave, call the reporting person, and explain what I observed. Before I was able to dial, I heard a sound which haunts me every night. A chilling noise that will die with me. You won't believe me, and I don't blame you. It was the sound of intense laughter. Not a giggle, but delirious, gut-busting laughter from what sounded like an old lady. I never drew my Glock faster than I did right then. "Hello? Who's in there?" Before I could finish the sentence, it stopped. I'm not too embarrassed to admit that I turned around and bolted for my car, gun in hand. Just as I left the porch, I was stopped in my tracks. Another equally loud and terrifying noise echoed from the house. This time, it was a scream of someone clearly in distress. It sounded like the same voice, but I wasn't sure. Dang it, I thought to myself. Exigent circumstances. I radioed dispatch and told them what I heard. I advised them that I would be clearing the house. Another officer started en route, but I couldn't wait. I wanted to, but there was no way I could explain waiting 15 to 20 minutes to enter the house of an elderly woman in danger. I entered the hot living room and cleared the immediate area. I knew at least one person was upstairs. The narrow staircase led to a pitch-black second floor. Before going up, I announced myself again, and again, to no avail. I began walking up the staircase as calmly as I could. I remember imagining a scenario where I'm clearing the bedrooms and Cynthia pops out of a dark corner. I'd have to explain to the reporting person why I shot her grandma in the face. When upstairs, I checked 2 rooms that were completely empty. No furniture or anything. I then realized that the last bedroom was the same one that had the light. I announced myself and prayed for a response. I didn't get one, so I grabbed the doorknob and twisted. I swung it open and was immediately met with a nauseating odor. It was the worst I'd ever experienced, almost knocking me down. I illuminated the room with my light. In every corner, on every wall, were dead, skinned cats pinned to wooden crosses. Some were rotten, some were fresh. There was dried blood literally everywhere. Fur and detached claws covered the floor. I dry-heaved as I cleared the closet. It was empty. I stumbled my way back downstairs where I vomited on the front porch. I ran to the road to wait for my partner. Once he arrived, we called for even more people and my supervisor. We cleared the house again with no signs of Cynthia. Fast forward to the next evening. The reporting person flew in with other family members. They searched the 10 or so acres and found an old abandoned car in the brush. They found her grandma there, leaned back in the passenger seat, deceased for what appeared to be several days. Neither detectives nor the medical examiner would determine the cause of death. Detectives interviewed another family member who said Cynthia had severe schizophrenia and dementia. Inside her home in a kitchen drawer, detectives discovered pages and pages of Hebrew writings. The writings translated to devoted allegiances to the devil Tarot, a devil god that many Satanists worship. Her writings claimed that Tarot asked her to sacrifice her beloved cats. Some believe that I heard Cynthia's laughter and scream and that the upstairs light was on. Some don't. Trust me, sometimes I question it myself. For some reason, My body camera never downloaded to the system. It's like the footage never existed, even though I know it was on. No other calls from that night downloaded either. It even baffled my department. I have constant nightmares about Cynthia. In them, she's laughing with the same terrifying laugh. She has unusually long fingers and nails that almost scrape the ground when she walks. I never move fast enough to get away from her. I reach for my gun, but it's never there. She always gets me, and then I wake up. I don't know why I'm still a cop. Maybe it's all I know how to do. I only have 12 more years and many, many more therapy sessions before I can retire. I wasn't a supernatural believer before my experience, but I am now. To those aspiring to be police officers, heed my advice. Be a firefighter instead.
Couple out of time from Grimoire. It should be noted that I no longer work at this place, but for the last year or so, I had a job at a certain German-owned grocery store. I did a little of everything at this store, but on this particular day I was a front-end cashier. Because we were really short-staffed, I was the only one ringing at the time, but there were other workers throughout the store stocking shelves and shopping for curbside, etc. As a front-end cashier, I checked out every customer. It wasn't a big deal as it was a slow day and still pretty early, so I was only ringing every 10 minutes or so. Because it was so slow, I was up and about cleaning and chatting with some of the regulars, that kind of thing. I had a clear view of the entrance because of this, so I noticed when this elderly couple walked in. They both looked very old, probably pushing their mid-70s, and both had plastic shopping bags hanging from their arms. I immediately got weird vibes from them. They were dressed really well, but maybe a little too well for a trip to this particular grocery store, if that makes sense. It's a bargain store known for relatively cheap prices. The man was in a tan and white three-piece suit, complete with a blue tie. He also had one of those fancy canes with a metal handle, which he was grasping while a heavy-looking bag weighed his arm down. The lady had really short white hair, big wire-rimmed glasses, and she was in a pressed white outfit, a mid-length white tube skirt, and a blue flower pinned to the white jacket. She was very small and frail-looking. This couple came up to me with their plastic bags and asked if there was a way to do returns. This particular store has an extremely lax return policy. Basically anything can be brought back as long as it isn't a specialty item. You can select a replacement for the item as well as get a refund for it. So, of course, I immediately agreed and led them to my register where I could ring the return. They dropped their bags on the belt and one of them came open slightly. Immediately I was hit with a really nasty smell like rotten garbage. Probably 10 or 15 big, fat flies came out of the opening. I tried not to react since the couple didn't seem to be bothered by the flies, and when the bags rolled up to me, I opened each one really carefully to see what was inside. There were 3 total. The first was full of moldy brown mush that looked like the kind of stuff you'd see at the bottom of a public trash can. The second bag was full of stinky, raw, gray meat that had maggots all over it. And the third bag just contained a few unopened packs of cookies. I was trying really hard not to gag. The smell was atrocious. The couple was just smiling at me, completely unmoved by the whole thing. I explained to them that I could just type in the item codes, but that they'd have to tell me what the heck I was even looking at. The lady responded, saying in this really weak and faraway voice,
"Vegetables? We got them just last week. And now look at them. Broccoli and cauliflower. All turned bad."
I looked at the mush again. Yeah, there was no way they got that just last week. This stuff looked like it had been in a hot trunk for 6 months, But I couldn't refuse them, so I agreed to type in the codes for broccoli and cauliflower. Then I asked about the meat.
Pork, I think,
The old lady said, her voice kind of dreamy.
We got that just this weekend, and now look. I opened it last night, and it was already like that.
I just smiled and nodded, but in my mind I was thinking, yep, no way. These people probably just raided our dumpster for stuff to exchange for free food and some extra cash. Scammers are pretty frequent at this store because the policy is so lax. But it's not my job to turn them down, and I wasn't paid enough to care that much about it, so I go ahead and type in the product code for the pork chops. Then I get to the cookies. I was happy to tie up the bags of rotten food and move on to something that didn't smell like vaporized food poisoning, but when I pulled the packages out, I got even more confused. It was 2 packs of Fig Newtons, and it was definitely from our store, but the label on it looked extremely dated. I tried scanning it just in case, and the machine just read error. I flipped the package and saw a date for 1993, which is before I was even born, mind you. The lady piped up,
Something wrong?
I looked up at the two and actually got a good look at them. They were both smiling, and they did look friendly and clean from a cursory glance, but their eyes, the whites of their eyes were all yellow, as you would see in someone who was jaundiced, but their skin didn't have that telltale yellow tint. They had these glazed, sort of blank expressions in their eyes, and their smiles definitely seemed forced. I just replied, no, I'll just type these in too. Scanner must be broken. Because honestly, I just wanted this transaction to end. I was very uncomfortable by this point. I issued the refund and the couple left the register, but they continued to wander aimlessly around the store for 2 hours. I watched them for most of that time, totally confused and creeped out. They didn't do anything suspicious in that time, but they did act extremely off. Like they would just pick stuff up and stare at it for an uncomfortably long time before setting it back down and then moving on to do the same thing again with a different item. I went on break and sort of put the whole thing out of my mind. When I got back, I was sent to do another job in the store, as my replacement cashier had gotten in and taken over. As I walked around the store, I actually did see that couple again, but this time the woman was lying in a pile of dog beds, and the man was just standing over her, staring off into space. I told my manager about it, and she checked in on them to see if the woman was okay. And she just sat up and said,
Yup. Just got tired. I was having a lie down for a moment.
and my manager was like, in the dog beds? And the lady nodded.
They're very soft, very good quality. You sell good stuff here, you know.
And that was, for all intents and purposes, the end of it. The lady stayed in the beds for a long time, but when she finally got up, she and who I assume was her husband, who never spoke a word at this whole time, just left, without buying anything or saying anything else. We all just scratched our heads after that. I've had family who've suffered from dementia and Alzheimer's, had strokes and seizures and all that. Of course I know everyone is different, but these two people didn't act like anything I've experienced before. I don't know if they were ill or on some kind of medication that made them act weird, or if they were just a genuinely strange pair. Then there's the issue of them being so well dressed and clean looking, but having long, rotten foods that they claimed were only a week old. Plus the cookies with 1993 dates on them. It was all so bizarre, and we never actually saw the old couple again after that, which is also unusual because most of the customers we get live nearby and shop with decent regularity with us. I even asked one of the older managers who's been working in that location for about 14 years if she'd ever seen them before. She's one of those people who knows everyone and always gets caught up in long conversations with all the regulars, so She told me that she's never even seen them before. So there's no real closure to this event. Sorry if you're all expecting more, but this definitely takes the cake on being the weirdest thing that I've ever experienced during my time in retail. I'd be interested to hear what y'all think and if you've ever experienced anything like this before.
A not-so-friendly ghost. From Mystic Pizza. I live on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. Savannah is known for being a very haunted city, and I can attest to that. I live on a small house next to my grandmother's property. My brother and I grew up with our grandparents in a house they built when they got married. The house itself was a new addition to a 10-acre property my grandparents owned. The property was part of what used to be a large plantation. Ever since we were young, we'd experienced many supernatural things that happened at that house, so ghosts and the supernatural became something we were used to. After I got married, we had a little house built next to Grandma's, and my brother moved closer to downtown Savannah. He's a tattoo artist, so the first thing he did was to look for a place to rent near downtown, which he turned into a tattoo studio. He's a pretty good tattoo artist, but he's really bad at managing the business. And since I have absolutely not one artistic bone in my body, but I'm very good at managing a business, I decided to help him with management of the studio. When we moved into the soon-to-be tattoo studio, the landlord informed us that the previous occupant had left because she believed that the place was haunted. But my brother and I grew up in a haunted house, so we didn't really mind. Since the first week of us moving in, stuff began to happen. Every morning when I would get to the business, there would be something knocked down. It would be the pictures we had on the walls or magazines we had on the shelf. I personally had a few stuffed animals on a shelf next to a few albums of clients' tattoos, and those stuffed animals would always be on the floor. My brother would not experience as much activity as me. It seemed the spirits in the shop didn't like me much or liked to scare me more than my brother. Now keep in mind, the tattoo studio is 2 stories. The bottom was where people got their tattoos, and upstairs was the office, a small kitchen, and a break room. I spent most of my day upstairs, and I would often hear footsteps going up or down the stairs. One day when I was in my office, I could hear people talking in the break room, so I went in to join them, but as soon as I opened the door, the voices died down, and I saw that no one was in there. Most of this didn't bother me, since it was either noises or voices, or the stuff I would find on the floor. But it never seemed aggressive, and I'd never felt threatened in any way. One day after work, we had a few friends stop by. We were talking about what had been happening since we moved here, but they didn't believe what I told them. One of them jokingly said, "Why would any ghost want to hang around here? Come on in, Mr. Ghost, and explain it to us." They started joking, making fun of things. Well, apparently, the ghost didn't like that conversation. A while later, we heard a crash coming from upstairs. All of us ran up to see what had happened. When we got to the top, a chair which had previously been inside the break room was now lying in the hallway like it had been thrown. Our friends turned pale and got the heck out of there as fast as they could. I, like always, stayed behind cleaning up the mess. I was coming down the stairs when I caught a glimpse of someone moving on the bottom floor. I called out because I could make out what seemed to be a person wearing a blue or gray uniform. But when I got to the bottom of the stairs, no one was there. That was not the only time I saw that person in the uniform. About a week later, I got up early to head to work. It was supposed to rain that day, and I wanted to avoid driving during the worst of the rain. I arrived at the studio. It then began raining harder, so I sat inside my car for a bit, waiting for the rain to stop. My parking space was right in front of the studio. I sat inside the car and I looked toward the studio, the front of which had some very large windows on the bottom floor and smaller windows on the top. For some reason, I happened to look up and I could see someone inside. It looked to be a man, so I picked up my phone and called my brother. I asked if he was already inside. He said no, he was still at home. I told him I saw someone inside the studio. He told me to wait outside until he got there. I looked at the window, and the man I had seen was now gone. About half an hour later, my brother showed up. Together we went inside but found nothing, just the regular mess as usual. I should mention here that since the night we had our friends over and they made a joke about the ghost, the place changed somewhat. Before, the spirit there seemed mischievous. Messes, voices, noises, nothing really scary. But after that night, I began feeling watched, like that feeling you get when someone that is talking about you or doesn't like you is looking at you with hatred. It was uncomfortable. It got to the point that I didn't even want to go to work. One day we had a client come in. She was getting a pretty big tattoo and had her 4-year-old daughter with her. She called me before her appointment and said her babysitter had canceled on her, and she was going to have to cancel. She'd been looking forward to her tattoo, so I told her she could bring her daughter with her and I would keep an eye out on her while she got her tattoo done. She got there and I took the little girl upstairs while she got her tattoo. The girl was playing with some of her toys and a few of the stuffed animals I kept downstairs. Hours passed and I could see she was a bit anxious. She kept saying she wanted mommy, so we got her toys and went downstairs. Her mom was soon done, and before she left, I began heading upstairs, but the little girl stopped me, saying, "Don't go up there. The scary man said no." I looked at her and asked, "Where is this scary man?" She pointed to the stairs. I stayed there until closing time. Things remained the same. My brother and I did the best we could. Things slowly started calming down a bit, until we had another get-together with some friends. It was my brother's birthday, so some of our friends and I decided to throw a little surprise party. At this point, all of our friends knew what was going on. Some had experienced things themselves, and some had heard about the goings-on at the studio. We closed up shop and stayed there eating and drinking and having a good time. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We were about to leave when I realized I'd left my purse upstairs, back in my office. I asked a friend to go with me. I got my purse and my friend started down the stairs. I was at the top about to head down when I heard a growl next to my ear. Then I felt a push and down I went. I know what you're thinking, that I was drunk. I'd been drinking and probably lost my balance. But I was sober. I was the designated driver. I was the one that was going to drive everyone home. Everybody was freaking out. They called an ambulance to take me to the hospital, and I called my husband so he could drive everyone home. Turns out I broke my foot. My husband was pretty upset, so was my brother, and I, frankly, was tired. Don't get me wrong, my brother and I had many experiences with the supernatural, but this was the only time that something had hurt us, or me. I stayed home for about 2 weeks and tried to help as much as I could from home, but there are some things that I could not take care of from home. My brother kept asking me to come back to work. I think he was a little afraid to be there alone after closing. So I relented and decided to go back to work. I couldn't drive, so my husband would drop me off before work and would pick me up after he got off work. The week after I got back to work, we had a friend come visit from Louisiana. She was also a tattoo artist and was going to go to a tattoo convention sort of thing, which is where you see other artists' works. You can also find out what's new in the tattoo world, like inks or new equipment and such. She got to the shop with a big smile, but as soon as she walked in, she froze. Her smile vanished. She looked at me and said, "That man doesn't like you. He also doesn't like the fact you guys have parties here." I knew she was a little sensitive to spirits, but since ghosts never bothered me, I never really asked her anything. She said he had been a soldier in his previous life and had just been wandering around the area after he died. I asked why he was here, that I knew for a fact he had not been here before. She looked at me and simply said, "He said he was invited." I explained what had happened and she told me to do a few things. She said to open all the doors and windows, get holy water, and sprinkle it around the studio while praying. She said to have a cross blessed and hang it at the front door. She also had me bless smaller crosses and hang them at each window. Afterward, she said to close the doors and windows. She told me to bless the place every time things began to feel heavy again. I did everything she said, step by step, and I'm happy to say that our studio has gone back to normal. Well, we still have a few voices, but nothing threatening. And I'm okay with that. I know he's still hanging out outside the studio. I see him from time to time, and I stay away when I do, because frankly, he scares me. One time I got to the street that turns into the studio. It was raining really hard, and not many people were about. I turned into the plaza, and as I got closer to the studio, my radio went crazy, changing stations on its own. I turned my head and saw a man wearing a uniform crossing the road. He got halfway across and slowly started to fade away. I turned into my parking space and ran inside. I know he's still out there, but in here in our studio, with our friendly ghosts, I feel safe, and I plan to keep it this way with him outside. I wasn't talking to my sister. From Anna C. This happened to me a few hours before I started preparing for work that day. It started late one night, having woke up from sleep. I figured it was too dark out for me to start preparing for work for the day. I was about to go back to sleep when I noticed that one of our dogs was throwing up near my bed. More concerned about the dog than the mess on the wooden floorboards, I went over to him and tried soothing him. When he stopped throwing up, he scrambled up to my bed and began sleeping. That's when I noticed my sister sitting on her bed across from mine. She was looking at me in silence. I headed for the bathroom, which was part of our shared bedroom, asking her to help me clean up the mess on the floor. I got some toilet paper and went back to our room. My sister was still on her bed, sitting crisscross. She was wearing a pair of shorts and a loose white shirt. I was annoyed, seeing as how she hadn't even gotten up to help me. So I told her again to get up, that we still have this mess to get rid of. I began cleaning up and she still just sat there. She was doing absolutely nothing. She said absolutely nothing. I could feel her eyes on me though. I stood up from the floor, telling her that I would get another batch of toilet paper, but this time she should help me out. I looked at her as I was saying this while making my way back to the bathroom. This time she looked back at me, but still said nothing. A few seconds later, I was out of the bathroom and I was surprised to see that my sister was gone from the room. Mumbling to myself about how I'll just scold her later, I went back to cleaning up the last traces of the mess. Once that was done, I was ready to go back to my bed. I decided to look for my sister first. It was late at night, past midnight. Where could she have gone? I went out of our room and checked the different areas of the house. Everything was so quiet. Most every room was dark, the lights inside still turned off. I even opened up the front door to make sure she wasn't outside, doing who knows what. I was greeted by the lone light bulb dangling near our front door. Everything was quiet there too. I shut the door and went back to our room, thinking I'd find her there and I just missed her. But her bed was still empty. I flopped down on my bed, figuring she probably went to our aunt's house, which sat beside ours. They keep late nights there. As I was drifting off to sleep, that was when I remembered something. My sister was on the night shift. She wasn't supposed to be at home during this time. She hadn't been here this entire time. You bet I sat up right then and there as if someone had dumped an ice-cold bucket of water on me. I looked around our room. It was empty, except for me and the dog at the foot of my bed, sleeping soundly. My heart was galloping like crazy. I reached for my mobile phone, dialing my sister's supervisor's phone number. When the supervisor picked up my call, I asked her as calmly as I could if I could please talk to my sister. I apologized for calling so suddenly, but it was kind of an important and urgent matter. The supervisor said she understood, no problem. A couple of seconds later, I heard my sister's familiar voice on the line. I was shocked. I told her the real reason I was calling, stuttering and mumbling on some parts. My sister was creeped out. I told her I didn't know what it meant when I saw her doppelganger, but I wanted to make sure she was safe. She told me not to worry. I hung up and looked around the room once more. It was dark, save for the light leaking from the window and the bedroom door, which I forgot to close. I just experienced my first ever doppelganger encounter. I even talked to the thing. This experience was very unreal, but it wasn't scary. I felt nothing sinister from it. It was just there. Its eyes followed my movements. She never talked, and I belatedly realized she never blinked either. And I wonder up to this day if all doppelgangers don't blink. New Hire Nightmare from Parkler. Back in 2015, I was working in food service, specifically as a supervisor for a coffee shop. Pretty soon into my actual training, the manager at the time decided she was going to leave and open up her own coffee shop. She hired maybe 3 to 4 people before leaving so that we wouldn't, in her words, be short-staffed. While doing this, she was not as careful as she was before about who she was hiring, which brings me to my work nightmare. Tony will be his name in the story. Tony seemed nice at first. He was probably in his early 20s, average height and thin build. I was a short 23-year-old who was living as a stealth male, as I was transitioning from female to male. At this point, I have almost all of my surgeries and have been on hormones for 3 years, so there was truly no questioning. People didn't know unless they were told. My coworkers were all well aware, because they had been there for most of my surgeries. Tony was not very good at his job. He was struggling to pick it up and was stressing everybody out. I always tried to be nice to him though, because I know how hard learning all that could be, and that's just my general personality. One night while I was sitting at the bar with my dad and my best friend, enjoying a drink before a lacrosse game, I got a Facebook message request. I skimmed through the profile of someone named Riley for a minute and then opened the message. It seemed normal. It consisted of a standard greeting, a simple "Hi, how are you?" And then it turned very dark very quickly when I asked who they were. It was obvious it was a fake account, so I didn't expect anything other than to be trolled. That was until they said that they knew who I was and where I worked, which wasn't out of the ordinary. A lot of our regulars were super friendly with me, so much so that they would often give me gifts before my surgeries. But this certainly was not a regular. As I opened up the new message after hearing the familiar ding and feeling the phone vibrate, I was horrified. It was a slew of messages threatening to throw hot coffee on my face, beat me up at work, and many more things. The messages taunted me, saying I couldn't prepare for it because I had no idea who they were, so I wouldn't know who to look out for. Now, I know that doesn't sound too scary, but let me set the scene. I worked at a kiosk in the mall. Everything around me was open, as well as the back of the kiosk being wide open to a seating area for us, as well as a staircase leading to and from upstairs. There was very little protection. When the mall and police came together and did drills for active shooters, we would have to go hide in other stores or hope we could make it to the back room, which was down a dark, barely lit old hallway that was not as populated as you would think. A few days passed from getting the first message request, and I'm still getting these messages, but I'm not answering as much, if at all, sometimes. I was hoping that if they didn't get the responses they wanted, they would just leave me alone. But then they said something one day. It was something that keyed me in on the fact that this was Tony. Tony made a comment about how I was not a real man, and that while I was going down the hall to the back room at night, they were going to teach me a lesson. And he threatened me with sexual assault, stating that no one could help me. I was horrified. At this point, most of my coworkers knew a little bit about what was going on, enough that they were all worried and protective over me, which made the kiosk tense, especially since everyone agreed it was probably Tony. Our manager refused to listen to us, but said he would put us on separate shifts. My brother even went and bought me a keychain with mace on it, which you have to travel outside of where we live to a state 3 hours over to purchase. I added that to my keys for work, and my ex-boyfriend at the time made sure that I had a small wooden baseball bat in my car at all times. Whenever I would go on break, whether Tony was working or not, especially when he wasn't, all my coworkers would keep an eye out on the open spots of the kiosk to make sure everything was okay. I remember vividly one time, one of the shyest coworkers peered over the kiosk and could not see where I was sitting, and quickly ran out panicking. Those messages kept coming with threats, and eventually we hit a breaking point. One day we were slammed with customers, and Tony was working. Most of the customers were being polite about the wait, and with Tony not being too good at his job yet. I tossed him on the register. We had 2 of them, so he wasn't working alone. I was supporting the staff by filling the ice bins, getting them things they were low and out of, when suddenly a coworker walked up. They were pale and looked flustered. I was told a customer wanted to speak to the person in charge, so I stepped outside the kiosk, taking off my apron and approaching the woman away from everyone. The woman told me that she didn't want to get anyone in trouble, and by that sentence alone I knew it would be bad, but I could have never imagined what she would tell me next. She proceeded to explain that not only was Tony rude when she told him he gave her the wrong food item and complained her drink order was too crazy, it was only a hot latte with 2 Splendas, but then told her it was her fault because she sounded like, quote unquote, she had a man's groin in her mouth. At this point, the poor lady was holding back tears. She told me she was already self-conscious about her voice, as she had beat cancer and was left with her voice changed forever. I wish I could have seen my face because I was mortified. I quickly began apologizing, asking her to wait around a moment while I called our manager and HR. I asked a coworker to run the floor for a moment and told Tony to go do some back-of-house work, like cleaning the milk fridge. Once Tony walked away, I filled 4 recovery cards and refunded the woman's order while calling the manager. The customer left, telling me I didn't have to do all of that, but that I made the situation right just by being kind. A day passed, and Tony was given a final warning. I dreaded having to work with him, but I knew during launch week I had no choice. One night, after a few really disgusting messages from Riley, I deliberately said something that I figured would make Tony finally admit it was him. And sure enough it did, but not how I was planning. I came in for my shift the next day. The manager asked to have a meeting with me. I walked into the back room with another supervisor who was also asked to be there. And who else was there? Tony. Turns out Tony claimed that I was saying racist things to him, and without me having proof, I was given a warning. That's when Tony turned around and specifically mentioned how over Facebook I called him a sexual predator, which I'd only said to this Riley. I looked at Tony and I yelled, "I knew it was you!" He tried to turn it around and said that it was his friends. That was the icing on the cake. My manager finally had something to prove that he was the one messaging me. He was fired that day on the spot. Work felt a lot less stressful, but we were all still pretty worried because now he was angry at me. My manager reached out to the mall security, and that's when we found out the most amusing news. Something the original manager should have found out earlier when she hired Tony. Tony was banned from the mall a year prior. He wasn't even supposed to be in the mall. After a bit of time passed and he was no longer able to come to the mall, I began to enjoy my work again. So, Tony, let's never meet again.
My most horrifying experience as a cop. An account shared with us by Mythology Loves Horror. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, acing my exams and tests. It wasn't long before I had a job offer after my official graduation. Despite the job being across the country, I eagerly took a flight and flew over, wanting to be seen as dependable and excited. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or angry bull moose don't kill you, then there's still plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the State Police Barracks in Newport, I thought it'd be all pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup, but I was wrong. I originally came from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough woman, but I know now that I'm woefully unequipped to handle everything out there. I don't think anyone's equipped to handle a situation like this one. The call that started this experience should have been a standard domestic abuse case. But it turned into something else. In the 3.5 years that I've been there, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished by fallen trees, cars that had been totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought all that was bad enough, but I was not prepared to find myself in a situation that I could not logic my way out of. I didn't have any paperwork left to do that Saturday, and because I'm trained in the field, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse call that had just come in. His partner had already gone home for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out to the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field in a few months, and I'd been itching for some action now, especially since my most recent class had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining them into my mind. We were to speak with a Mr. B who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, and eventually we found ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was nearly up to our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch black out. It was a concerned neighbor who had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We'd been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, but apparently that was not the case. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a strangely pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted for about 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was more a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop. My adrenaline was pumping so hard that I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Protocol dictates that we could go next door and question the suspect, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize their safety over standard inquiries. This being the case, we sprinted from the porch, making our way as quickly and carefully as we could towards that awkward sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams. Each of them getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved, and as we made our way deeper into the woods, we quietly discussed whether or not we thought it was an animal or a person. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally beginning to approach the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for someone to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to whoever was hurt, but there was no other sounds. I had been checking for footprints, but there were only ours and deer tracks. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, but even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area and hadn't seen any signs of a blood trail or struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomenon that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of that scream from when we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate. And then there was a chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunching for a long time, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split moment, I thought that I saw his eyes shine bright yellow in the beam from my flashlight. I dismissed that thought, knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of here. He looked almost angry for a moment, then he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right. I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arm and all but dragged him back through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get us through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway back to the house, the scream came again, this time sounding like it was right next to me. In a panic, I frantically shone my flashlight around in every direction to find what we were being pursued by. But there was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was not even a glint of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sounds of footfalls, just tense silence after that scream. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air. But I swear, I heard it calling my name. By then, I was too horrified to go back out there. I tried my best to keep my wits about me, enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. But she never did call again, and the officer who did a follow-up the next day did not report anything unusual. That night, I got Officer T and I out of there as fast as the cruiser would go, and I don't regret that choice. I still have no idea what was in those woods, but as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, telling me that I should be glad I got out of there alive. He says that the danger that night was closer than I knew. I think only he knows how close of a call it was.
Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com.